Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are leaving behind the world of ordinary struggle and stepping into something far more gilded. The private world of the wealthiest citizens of ancient Greece. Not the version carved into marble busts and printed in textbooks, but the version that actually happened behind closed doors, where every comfort you can imagine was quietly built on someone else's exhaustion. Before we drift into tonight's journey, thank you for being here night after night, in the quiet hours when the rest of the world has gone dark. This channel exists because of you, because of the people who write in asking for one more story, one more slow wandering journey through a century or a civilization long gone. If you find comfort in these words, a like helps more people find their way here, and a subscription means you will never miss a night, but only if it feels right to you. There is no pressure in this room, only rest. Now settle in. Turn off the harsh lights. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background if that helps you drift. Tonight we are going to imagine a single day, from the first gray light of dawn to the last flickering lamp of night, in the life of a wealthy citizen of ancient Athens. We will ask the questions nobody thought to ask in school. What did it actually feel like to wake up in a house built entirely around a hole in the ground? What did the rich actually eat when nobody was performing for anyone? How did anyone stay clean without soap? And why did being rich in Athens sometimes mean being watched more closely than anyone else? And underneath all of it, whose hands built the comfort that history remembers as elegance, you are about to wake up in Athens in the 5th century before our era, in the shining, dangerous, unequal high point of its golden age. You are wealthy. You are a citizen. You are about to discover exactly how much of your comfortable life you did not build yourself. The morning begins, as mornings often do, with a small betrayal of expectations. Whatever picture you had in your mind of a rich man's bed, put it away. Your mattress is a wooden frame threaded with tight leather strips, topped with a stuffed wool pad. It is better than the straw pallet of a poor household, certainly, but only in the way that a padded bench is better than a bare one. There are no springs here, no soft give beneath your back, only the firm complaint of wood and rope holding you a few inches off the floor. Your house itself, if you could see it from above, would look strange to modern eyes. It is built around a central courtyard open to the sky, with rooms arranged around that open square rather than along a corridor. There is no hallway as you understand one. To reach the kitchen from your bedroom, you cross the courtyard. To reach the drinking room from the courtyard, you cross it again. Every room faces inward, toward the light and air of that open center, rather than outward toward the noise and grime of the street. You are already not alone. Before your feet have touched the floor, someone enslaved in your household is moving through the house with water, because a wealthy man does not fetch his own water, does not light his own lamp, does not do very much of anything for himself at all. This is simply how the morning works, and you have never once questioned it, because to you it feels less like privilege and more like the natural order of things. We will come back to this because it deserves far more than a passing thought, but for now, let it sit quietly in the back of your mind as you rise. Let's look more closely at the house you are standing in, because it tells you a great deal about what wealth actually meant here. From the street, your home reveals almost nothing. A blank mud brick wall, a single modest door, no windows facing outward to tempt a thief or a gossip. The wealth is entirely inside, hidden from view, because a wise Athenian did not advertise his fortune to every passerby. Behind that plain door, though, is a different story. The courtyard opens up bright and airy, ringed by a covered walkway held up on wooden or stone columns, and every important room in the house takes its light and air from that shared open center. The floors beneath your feet are hard-packed earth in the working areas, sometimes covered with simple pebble mosaics in the finer rooms, small stones set into patterns that would have taken a skilled craftsman days to lay. There is no glass in any window, because glass suitable for windows is not yet a thing your world has invented. Instead, the window openings are small, shuttered with wood, or simply left open to the elements, which means that on a rainy morning, a fair amount of the sky's mood arrives directly on your floor. The walls themselves are sun-dried mud bricks set on a modest stone foundation, plastered over and sometimes painted, but structurally not much stronger than the walls of a far poorer home. This is an uncomfortable truth about wealth in Athens. It bought you decoration, comfort, and staff, but it did not necessarily buy you security. Burglars in this city were known by a rather blunt nickname that translates roughly to wall diggers, because breaking into a house often meant literally digging through the soft mud brick wall rather than bothering with the door. Your fine possessions inside are protected more by social reputation and the presence of your household than by any real physical barrier. The finest room in your entire home is reserved not for you to sleep in, but for you to entertain in. It is the room where tonight's drinking party will unfold, deliberately positioned with its doorway set slightly off-center so that couches can be arranged unbroken along every wall. Everything else in the house, by comparison, feels almost utilitarian. There is a kitchen area with an open hearth for cooking, storerooms stacked with jars of oil, wine, and grain, and modest quarters where your household staff sleep. Upstairs, or tucked toward the back in a single-story home, are the rooms belonging to the women of your household, positioned deliberately away from the entrance, away from the eyes of any visitor who might wander in. Furniture, by modern standards, is sparse everywhere you look. A handful of couches, a few three-legged stools, a low table or two. Wooden chests for storing clothing and valuables, because the built-in closet has not been invented and will not be for a very long time yet. There is no plumbing to speak of. Waste is collected in a chamber pot and carried out by household staff to be dumped, often simply into the street, which we will discuss shortly, and which explains a great deal about the smell of ancient Athens. At night, your only light comes from small clay lamps burning olive oil, casting a dim, flickering, smoky glow that does little more than push the darkness back a few feet. Warmth, when the air turns cold, comes from portable braziers of glowing charcoal, carried from room to room as needed, like a small mobile hearth following you through your own home. And all around you, before you have even fully woken, the house is already alive with quiet motion. Water is being drawn from a well or a public fountain. Bread is being prepared. The courtyard is being swept clean of yesterday's dust. Your entire morning, your comfort, your ease, arrives to you fully assembled as though summoned by magic. It is not magic, it is people. And they deserve a much closer look than most retellings of this era ever give them. Let's sit with this honestly for a moment, because it matters. Everything comfortable about the life you are about to live today rests on the labor of enslaved people, and there are a great many of them in a household like yours. A prosperous Athenian family might own a dozen enslaved people or more, while the city as a whole depended on the labor of tens of thousands. They cook for you, weave your clothing, walk your children to their lessons, and quietly keep the entire household functioning while you receive the credit for its grace and order. To you, this arrangement feels as unremarkable as running water feels to a modern person, which is precisely what makes it worth pausing on. Where do these enslaved people come from? The answer is neither simple nor gentle. Some were captured during war and marched home as the human spoils of victory. Some were seized by pirates and sold at market like any other cargo. Some passed through the hands of traders who moved people across the sea the same way they moved wine or pottery. And many were simply born into it, because under Athenian law, the child of an enslaved woman belonged to her owner from the moment of birth, with no path out unless freedom was granted. Their lives, once enslaved, varied enormously, and this is where the truth turns genuinely difficult to sit with. If you belong to a household like this one, your existence, though hard, was at least survivable. You cooked, you cleaned, you hauled water, you minded children, you worked the loom, living close enough to the family that the line between servant and something almost like kin could blur, without ever actually disappearing. Some particularly skilled craftsmen among the enslaved even lived with a strange kind of independence, running their own workshops and handing over the bulk of their earnings to their legal owner, an arrangement considered generous mostly by the person receiving the money. But if instead you were sent to labor in the silver mines outside the city, You entered a short and brutal existence in cramped, airless tunnels that very few workers ever walked out of. Same city, same laws, an entirely different and often fatal outcome, depending on nothing more than which task you were assigned. Under Athenian law, an enslaved person was legally property. They could be bought, sold, gifted, or wagered away entirely. They could not marry with legal recognition, could not own themselves, and could not refuse an order. Punishment was physical and expected, and in one of the coldest legal details this era has left behind, the testimony of an enslaved person was only considered valid in court if it had been extracted under torture, on the reasoning that a free man might lie to protect himself, while an enslaved person was assumed to only tell the truth when in pain. It is a hard fact to hear, and it is meant to be. And yet the strangest part, if you sit inside this world rather than looking at it from outside, is how invisible all of this feels from your own perspective. The enslaved woman who nursed you as an infant, the tutor's escort who walked you to your lessons and corrected your posture with a firm hand, the cook whose skill earns you praise at every dinner party you host. Every one of these people shaped your daily life more intimately than most of your own relatives, and every one of them could be sold away tomorrow without a word of explanation owed to them. Tonight, you will lift a cup of watered wine and toast your own good fortune, your refined taste, your fine breeding. And every part of that comfort was carried to you, prepared for you, and cleaned up after by someone who received nothing for the effort except the certainty of doing it again tomorrow. It is worth remembering, even as we move forward into gentler, stranger details of daily life, but enough heaviness for one morning. There is a body to attend to, and in ancient Greece, that turns out to be a stranger process than you might expect. It is time to get clean. Soap, in the form you understand it, simply does not exist in this world. Instead, your morning ritual involves coating your entire body in olive oil, letting it mix with the dust and sweat left over from the day before, and then scraping the whole mixture off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. In effect, you are squeegeeing yourself clean the way you might clear water from a windshield. The oil itself is not cheap. It is often perfumed, and using generous amounts of it is considered a genuine mark of sophistication, which means that the wealthier you are, the more elaborately you get to remove your own grime. It sounds faintly absurd, and it is, but the results are real. Your skin stays soft, and you carry a faint scent that, to Athenian noses, reads as expensive rather than odd. Understand that olive oil in your life is not simply something you cook with. It is the single most versatile substance you own. It moisturizes your skin, cleanses your body, fuels your household lamps, and forms the base of every perfume in your collection. Entire fortunes in this city are built on the olive trade. Entire conflicts have been fought over groves of these trees, and the gods themselves are credited with the gift of it. According to the old story, the goddess Athena won the patronage of this very city by offering its people the olive tree, a detail that tells you exactly how central this humble fruit has become to your civilization. For someone of your standing, the true display of wealth is scent. You do not simply oil your skin. You oil it with fragrance, kept in small round flasks and blended with rose, iris, or myrrh. A particularly fashionable man might even wear a different scent on different parts of his body, a habit that even some of your fellow Athenians consider a bit excessive. The more traditional voices in society grumble that this level of attention to fragrance is soft, indulgent, and a touch unmanly. The wealthy, naturally, ignore the criticism and simply purchase more. Then there is the matter of your hair, which follows fashion with the rigidity of a uniform. A respectable adult Athenian man wears a full beard always, because a bare face marks you as either a boy who has not yet come of age or a foreigner from beyond the city's borders. Your hair is kept short and neatly trimmed, since long flowing locks are associated with old-fashioned aristocratic affectation. Or worse, with the customs of rival Sparta. For the women of your household, the standard runs in the opposite direction entirely. Hair is grown long, oiled, curled, braided, and pinned into elaborate arrangements, All of it done indoors and all of it done by the skilled hands of enslaved women. Now for the part of the morning routine that offers little comfort. Your teeth. There is no toothbrush in this world, no toothpaste, and nothing resembling a trained dentist. The best available option is to rinse your mouth with water, rub your teeth with a rough cloth, and perhaps chew on something fragrant in the hope of freshening your breath, a battle that is very often quietly lost. Bad breath is so universally common in this era that it barely registers as remarkable, a simple background fact of nearly every conversation, every whispered secret, every romantic moment you will ever have. You will leave your home this morning smelling faintly of expensive perfume from the shoulders down, and of last night's wine from the mouth outward, and not a single person around you will find this strange. As for washing more thoroughly, your home has basins of water, and the city offers cold public facilities, but a proper hot bath is a rare indulgence rather than a daily habit. For the most part, your cleanliness routine begins and ends with oil and the patient work of the strigil, the ancient world's closest approximation of a hot shower. So you rise this morning gleaming, faintly fragrant and freshly scraped clean, ready to face the day looking every bit as prosperous as you actually are, which means, naturally, that it is time to get dressed. And Greek clothing, as it turns out, is an adventure entirely its own. Now for the wardrobe, and here you will need to make peace with the idea that Greek fashion is built almost entirely around rectangles of cloth and a great deal of practiced confidence. Your basic garment is a long piece of linen or fine wool, pinned carefully at the shoulders and gathered at the waist with a belt. There are no buttons here, no fitted seams, no tailoring in the way a modern person would understand it, and absolutely no forgiveness if the fabric slips at the wrong moment in public. Over this base layer, you drape a second, even larger rectangle of cloth, arranged across your body with real deliberation, because a gentleman who wears his outer cloak carelessly is mocked as thoroughly as a modern man might be mocked for showing up to an important meeting in his bathrobe. The wool is fine, the dye is costly, and the overall effect announces wealth and taste to anyone who knows how to read it. It also means you are, quite literally, one strong gust of wind away from a very public embarrassment. There is a strange kind of genius in this style of dress, if you are inclined to be generous about it. The same rectangle of cloth fits you whether you gain weight, lose weight, or grow several inches taller, which is more than can be said for anything hanging in a modern closet. The catch, of course, is that keeping the whole arrangement in place depends entirely on pins, brooches, and a firmly tied belt. Lose a pin at the wrong moment in a crowded street, and your dignity goes with it. Those pins, interestingly, are remembered in Athenian storytelling for a moment of real violence. According to an old account passed down through the city, a group of women once turned on a man bringing terrible news and used the long pins from their own garments as weapons against him. The horrified reaction of the city afterward was not to reconsider anything about how women were treated, but instead to change fashion itself, phasing out the long, dangerous pins in favor of something less capable of harm. It is a very particular kind of solution. When something goes wrong, restrict the women and leave the underlying problem entirely untouched. Color, more than almost anything else you wear, is where your wealth becomes visible at a glance. Most ordinary clothing in the city is left the natural off-white of undyed wool, or a plain, practical brown, simply because quality dye is extraordinarily expensive to produce. The most prized color of all is a deep reddish purple, extracted in tiny, painstaking quantities from thousands of sea snails through a process so foul-smelling and labor-intensive that the finished cloth can cost more than its own weight in gold. To wear that particular shade of purple is to walk through the city wrapped in a visible fortune, and everyone who sees you knows exactly what that fortune represents. Clothing style also varies sharply depending on your place in society. Working men and enslaved laborers wear a shorter, simpler garment pinned at only one shoulder, deliberately leaving the other arm free for physical labor. Young men, messengers, and travelers often favor a shorter cloak, easier to move in and considerably less likely to trip its wearer during a run or a ride. But for a man of leisure like yourself, the full-length outer cloak is the true statement piece, and wearing it correctly is treated by Athenian society as something close to a competitive sport. The unwritten rules are merciless. The fabric should fall in graceful, deliberate folds. Your left arm remains wrapped and tucked close to your body, while your right arm stays free to gesture as you speak. The hem must never drag through the filth of the street, must never ride up too high, must never look flung about carelessly. A man who has mastered this particular art looks calm, composed, and effortlessly superior to everyone around him. A man who fumbles it looks like he is losing a wrestling match with an oversized tent. And the entire unspoken point of your daily life is to be the first kind of man, never, under any circumstance, the second. Underwear, in case the question has crossed your mind, is largely optional and, for most of the population, largely absent altogether. You are, in a very real sense, one elegantly draped rectangle of cloth away from the open air. So you stand there this morning, draped, pinned, perfumed, and quietly wary of any strong breeze, dressed exactly as a wealthy citizen of Athens is expected to dress. And now, properly clothed at last, you can finally sit down to your first meal of the day, which is very likely going to disappoint you. Breakfast has arrived, and it is worth lowering your expectations immediately, because even in a household as wealthy as yours, the morning meal amounts to almost nothing at all. It typically consists of a piece of barley bread, dipped in a small amount of undiluted wine, perhaps accompanied by a handful of olives or figs if the household is feeling particularly indulgent that morning. That is, quite genuinely, the entire meal. There are no eggs, no honeyed pastries, no attendants fanning you while you recline and nibble at grapes. The people of this city simply do not believe in a substantial breakfast, whether rich or poor, and treat the whole affair as little more than a brief, practical bridge between sleep and the beginning of the real day. So you dunk your bread into your cup, sip wine at an hour that would deeply concern a modern physician, and console yourself with the fact that at least the bread in your household is exceptionally good bread. To understand why breakfast is treated so lightly, it helps to understand how the Greeks structure their eating throughout the day as a whole. There are 3 meals recognized in this world, and the morning meal is by far the least significant of the 3. At dawn comes this small, purely functional bite to stave off hunger. Around midday comes a light lunch, which we will get to shortly. And in the evening comes the true meal, the social meal, the one that actually matters, built around company, conversation, and if the household can afford it, genuine indulgence. Breakfast in this scheme exists purely to keep you from fainting before lunch arrives. Even the bread itself comes in 2 distinct grades, and your wealth shows through even at this small, unglamorous meal. Most residents of the city eat a coarse barley bread or paste, cheap, filling, and about as exciting as it sounds. The finer alternative is a proper wheat bread, lighter, softer, and considerably more expensive, which means it lands on tables like yours far more often than it does on the tables of most of the city. You are eating the good loaf this morning while the majority of Athens eats the plain one, and this small, unremarkable detail, more than any grand gesture, is what being wealthy actually feels like on an ordinary Tuesday. The wine at this hour deserves its own moment of attention, because to modern ears, wine at breakfast sounds like the opening line of a cautionary tale. But in this world, wine is treated the way water, coffee, and juice are treated combined, consumed from morning until night, at nearly every age, at nearly every meal. It is, in a practical sense, often safer to drink than the available water. It is cheerful, familiar, and simply what one does. The one unusual detail is that your dawn wine might be taken undiluted, because the elaborate rules around mixing wine with water that govern the rest of the day have not yet fully kicked in this early. Do not get too comfortable with that freedom. By evening, drinking your wine unmixed will mark you as something close to uncivilized. Alongside the bread and wine, you might find a handful of olives on the table, a few fresh or dried figs, a bit of cheese, and perhaps a small amount of honey if your household happens to keep bees or can afford to purchase it elsewhere. Fruit, when it is in season, is a small, genuine pleasure, though nothing about this meal is designed to feel like a feast. Restraint at the table is publicly admired throughout Athenian society, at least in theory, and a man who eats heavily first thing in the morning risks being quietly judged as soft, greedy, or both. There is something almost charming in the contrast, if you sit with it for a moment. The wealthiest man in the neighborhood, draped in perfumed cloth, attended by a household of servants, sits down each morning to a piece of hard bread and a small cup of wine, looking for all the world like a student who has simply overslept. Luxury in this city rarely announces itself through the size of what is on your plate. It announces itself through who prepared it, who served it, and who gets to spend the rest of the day at leisure while others labor on their behalf. And speaking of who is laboring and who is resting, there is a significant part of your own household you have been quietly overlooking all morning. It is time we looked at it properly. Before you head out into the bright, busy world beyond your front door, it is worth pausing to consider the part of your own home you will barely set foot in today, the women's quarters, tucked away toward the back of the house or on its upper floor. In a wealthy Athenian household, respectable women live largely apart from the men of the family, in rooms positioned well away from the entrance, and, by extension, well away from the eyes of any visitor who might happen to call. This arrangement is never officially described using a word like confinement, though in practice, the distinction is mostly a matter of vocabulary rather than lived experience. Here, your wife, your daughters, and the enslaved women of the household spend their spin wool, manage the household's daily business, and live lives spent almost entirely indoors. You, meanwhile, will spend your day in open sunlight at the training grounds, and in the crowded marketplace, occasionally wondering in an idle sort of way why the women of your household always seem so quiet when you pass through. The reasoning behind this arrangement, at least as Athenian society explains it to itself, centers on protection and honor. A respectable woman is meant to be shielded from the gaze of strange men, kept safe, kept pure in reputation, and above all, kept entirely out of the reach of gossip. There is a well-known saying, quietly admired by the men of this city, holding that the most virtuous woman is the one who is talked about least, whether in praise or in blame. The ideal woman, by this strange standard, is one the wider city barely knows exists at all. Sit with that thought for a moment, because it is a genuinely unsettling kind of compliment once you look at it closely. In practice, this belief splits your household cleanly into two separate worlds. The fine dining room where you will host tonight's gathering belongs entirely to the men, a space for entertaining, arguing, and drinking late into the night with your peers. The women's quarters belong entirely to the domestic machinery of the home, the actual daily work that keeps the household functioning. A properly behaved wife does not wander into your evening gatherings uninvited, and a properly behaved guest does not go looking for her there either. Your house, in effect, has a public face and a private one, and the women of your family live out nearly the whole of their lives on the private side of that invisible line. Even leaving the house is a carefully managed affair for a woman of your household. When a respectable woman does step outside, she goes veiled, modestly dressed, and always accompanied, never simply wandering the streets on her own whim the way you might. The socially acceptable reasons for a woman to be seen in public are limited and largely tied to religious life, festivals, funerals, family occasions, and the great civic rituals in which women play genuinely essential roles. These are meaningful outings, not casual errands, which is part of why the festival calendar matters so intensely to the women of this city. For many of them, it represents one of the very few doors leading out into the wider world. Here is the detail that reveals the whole arrangement for exactly what it is. This kind of seclusion is, itself, a form of luxury. Poorer women in this city cannot possibly remain indoors all day, because someone in their household has to sell goods in the marketplace, fetch water from the public fountains, work in the fields, or otherwise contribute directly to the family's survival. Their lives, by necessity, are lived very much in public view. So the ability to keep the women of your household hidden away, visibly performing no labor the outside world can see, becomes a quiet, deliberate announcement that your family is wealthy enough not to need their visible work. Confinement, dressed up as virtue, functions here as a genuine status symbol. It is worth remembering, too, that not every part of the Greek world follows this particular custom. In rival Sparta, women exercise openly, own property in their own right, speak their minds in public, and move through daily life with a degree of freedom that scandalizes more conservative Athenians, who mutter about it constantly as though it were a minor civic emergency. The seclusion you see in your own household is an Athenian preoccupation specifically, not a universal Greek one, which makes it considerably harder to defend as simple, uncomplicated common sense. So the women of your household remain upstairs this morning, spinning wool, managing accounts, and quietly running the machinery of your entire domestic life, while you prepare to head out and enjoy the wider city. It would be very easy from the outside to assume they spend their days doing very little of real importance. That assumption, if you actually tested it, would leave your household bankrupt within a single month. It is tempting, looking at a world this lopsided, to imagine that the woman of the house does essentially nothing of consequence. That assumption would be a serious and immediate mistake. Your wife is, in practical terms, the manager of your entire domestic economy, and it is a genuinely serious operation. She directs the household's enslaved staff, oversees the storage and rationing of food, supervises the weaving that clothes every single person under your roof, and keeps the accounts that quietly keep your family solvent, all while receiving essentially no public credit and no personal freedom in return. Greek writers of the era praise the ideal wife as a woman who is rarely seen and rarely heard, a strange way indeed to describe the person actually running the household's every function. There are even instructional texts from this period describing in detail how a husband ought to train his young wife to manage the home, comparing the process to training a soldier for battle. He shows her where every good is stored, how to assign daily tasks among the staff, how to keep supplies properly organized, and how to nurse the household back to health when illness strikes. In one particularly well-known account, a husband compares his wife approvingly to the queen bee at the center of a hive, sitting in place while the workers move in and out at her direction. It is intended as genuine praise. It also quietly admits, without seeming to notice it does so, that without her at the center, the entire hive would collapse. Consider everything that genuinely falls to her each day. Food arriving from your family's estates, and the local market has to be sorted, stored, and carefully rationed across the entire year so that nothing spoils too early and nothing runs short before the next harvest. Wool has to be cleaned, spun, and woven into the clothing, blankets, and cloaks that dress every person in your household, free and enslaved alike. The sick have to be tended and nursed back to health. The enslaved staff have to be organized, assigned specific tasks, and supervised throughout the day. The household accounts have to balance, and the children, the very future of your family line, have to be raised properly. She oversees or personally handles nearly all of it. Weaving in particular sits at the very center of what Athenian society considers the ideal wife's identity. It is such a central skill that even goddesses and queens in the old myths are depicted seated at the loom, and a woman's skill with wool is praised in this culture, the way a man's skill in battle or public debate might be. This is not treated as a quaint hobby on the side. The cloth a household produces carries genuine economic value, and a wife who runs her looms well is, in a very real sense, generating real household wealth. She is simply never permitted to describe her own contribution in those terms. Then there is the matter of the dowry, which grants her a narrow but genuine sliver of leverage in a world that otherwise offers her almost none. When she married into your family, Her own family sent a dowry along with her, and while you manage that money as head of the household, it is not, in the strictest legal sense, entirely yours to spend however you please. If the marriage were ever to end, that dowry is meant to return with her to her original family. This means a wife in this society is not entirely without power, because sending her away would mean sending a significant portion of household wealth away with her, and very few men are eager to see that happen. It is thin protection by any modern standard, but in her particular position, thin protection is still worth having. For all of this daily responsibility, she remains, in the strict eyes of Athenian law, a permanent legal minor. She cannot vote in the assembly, cannot represent herself directly in serious legal matters, and lives always under the formal authority of a male guardian, first her father, and later her husband. She likely married in her mid-teens, to a man like you who was already a fully established adult, and stepped almost immediately into the role of chief manager of a complex household, while still very nearly a child herself by any modern measure. So the next time you find yourself reclining comfortably and praising your own good fortune aloud to your guests, it is worth remembering exactly who actually keeps that fortune running smoothly day after day. And it is worth remembering, too, that somewhere within that busy, carefully ordered household, a new life may already be quietly beginning. Which brings us, gently, to the subject of children. Now to a gentler, and in places considerably darker, corner of your household, the children. If you are a wealthy family, your children have wet nurses, private tutors, toys to play with, and a genuinely comfortable start in life compared to most of the city. But the very beginning of that life is terrifyingly fragile, even for households with every advantage money can buy. Infant mortality in this era is brutal regardless of wealth, and a newborn is not formally welcomed into the family until a small ceremony held several days after birth. Once it seems reasonably likely, the child will actually survive infancy. It is also true, and worth stating plainly rather than dressing it up in softer language, that unwanted infants are sometimes abandoned, a practice Athenian society tolerates with a coldness that remains genuinely difficult to sit with from a modern vantage point. So you cradle your own surviving child this morning, grateful and quietly, uncomfortably aware that in this particular world, not even considerable wealth can promise you a certain tomorrow. The rituals surrounding a newborn reveal exactly how uncertain those first fragile days truly are. A few days after birth comes a ceremony in which the infant is carried swiftly around the household hearth, a formal gesture bringing the child into the family and under the protection of the home itself. Then, on the 10th day, comes a larger naming celebration, with family gathered, small gifts exchanged, and the child finally given a name it will carry for life. The reason these moments are deliberately delayed is heartbreakingly practical. So many newborns fail to survive even their first week of life that families consciously hold back their full emotional welcome, and often their full hearts, until the odds have improved even slightly. When a child does take hold of life and thrive, a wealthy home is a genuinely soft place to land. There are wet nurses, often enslaved or hired women, to feed and carry the infant through its earliest months. There are toys that would look surprisingly familiar to a modern parent, small rattles to shake, little clay dolls, miniature carts to pull along the floor, and the ever-popular knucklebones, which children toss and catch in games of skill not unlike modern jacks. There are household pets, indulgent grandparents nearby. And for a while at least, the simple, uncomplicated freedom of being small. But we cannot walk past the hardest truth of this particular world, and it deserves to be spoken carefully rather than sensationalized. Not every infant born into this society is kept. A newborn considered unwanted or sickly, or arriving into a family that already feels it has too many children or too many daughters, might be exposed, left outside rather than raised within the household. Some of these infants died as a direct result. Some were found by strangers and raised, often into a life of slavery rather than freedom. This practice was not universal, was not without its critics even at the time, and many families never engaged in it at all. But it was legal under Athenian law, it did happen, and the wider society tolerated it in a way that lands like a genuinely cold stone in the modern chest. We name this fact honestly here. We do not sit with it longer than necessary, and we do not pretend it did not exist. For the children who were welcomed and who survived those precarious early years, the path ahead splits sharply and early, entirely according to whether the child is a son or a daughter. A daughter's world will fold gradually inward, toward weaving, toward household management, toward the same secluded domestic life her own mother leads, and eventually toward a marriage arranged for her while she is still quite young. A son's world will open steadily outward, toward private tutors, toward the training grounds, toward the public assembly, toward the entire bright, visible public life available to a male citizen. The same nursery, the same toys, the same doting relatives gathered around, and yet two entirely different futures already quietly written before either child has even learned to walk on their own. You watch your children playing in the courtyard this morning, safe, warm, and fortunate in ways most children across the wider city will never experience. And you feel the particular tenderness of a parent living in a genuinely dangerous age, loving fiercely precisely because nothing about a child's survival here is ever truly guaranteed. And soon enough, at least for your son, these carefree early years will come to their natural end. It will be time to begin turning him into a proper Athenian gentleman, a project this society takes extraordinarily seriously. Assuming your son survives those precarious early years of infancy, it is time for the great, deliberate project of shaping him into a proper Athenian gentleman. A wealthy boy is handed over, day after day, to an enslaved escort whose entire responsibility is to walk him safely to his lessons, keep him out of trouble along the way, and correct his manners, sometimes gently and sometimes with the firm application of a stick. He learns to read and write, learns music on the lyre, learns poetry recited from memory until entire passages of the great epic poets live permanently in his mind. And eventually, if the family can afford the finest instruction available, he learns the crown jewel of a Greek education, the art of rhetoric, the skill of arguing so persuasively that a man might be entirely wrong and still walk away having won the room. Your daughter, meanwhile, is taught to weave and to manage a household. Athenian society describes this arrangement as a balanced education. A modern observer might reasonably describe it in far less flattering terms. The first important thing to understand about education in this city is that there is no public school system funding any part of it. Schooling here is entirely private, entirely purchased, which means a proper education becomes simply one more commodity that money buys and poverty quietly denies. A wealthy boy receives the complete package of instruction. A poor boy receives whatever scraps of learning his family can scrape together, if he receives any formal instruction at all. So even before your son has opened a single book, his family's wealth has already sorted him firmly into the fortunate minority. His days are divided among a small team of specialized instructors, each bringing a particular skill to the household. The first handles letters, teaching your son to read, to write using a pointed stylus pressed into a wax tablet that can be smoothed over and reused endlessly, and to perform basic arithmetic, often by physically shuffling small pebbles across a counting board. Paper in the modern sense does not exist in this world, and papyrus, imported from Egypt, is expensive enough that it is reserved for more permanent documents. So the humble, endlessly reusable wax tablet handles the daily grind of learning, functioning much like a modern scratch pad that never needs replacing. Then comes the music instructor, because a properly cultivated Athenian gentleman is expected to play the lyre competently and to sing with at least some skill. Music in this society is not treated as a casual hobby, but as a genuine component of shaping good character, thought to bring harmony and balance to the soul itself. And a man who cannot hold a tune at a dinner party is quietly, silently judged for the failure. Alongside musical training comes poetry, and above all, the great epic works attributed to Homer. Your son will memorize vast stretches of these poems, not simply as literature to be appreciated, but as something closer to a moral and cultural foundation, a source of heroic examples to imitate, values to internalize, and memorable phrases he will quote for the rest of his adult life in conversation and in public speeches alike. The third instructor is a physical trainer who takes the boy to the wrestling grounds and drills him relentlessly in running, wrestling, jumping, and throwing. A proper gentleman in this culture is expected to possess a fit, capable, aesthetically pleasing body just as much as a sharp and well-trained mind, and the two pursuits are considered complementary rather than competing for his limited time. A brilliant young mind housed in a weak, untrained body is, in the Athenian view, a project only half finished. Throughout all of this instruction looms the enslaved escort mentioned earlier, who is not himself a teacher but rather a guardian and constant supervisor. He walks the boy safely through the city's crowded streets, protects him from harm, watches his behavior closely throughout the day, and corrects him when necessary, sometimes with gentle words and sometimes with considerably firmer discipline. It is one of the deep, quiet ironies of this society that the daily moral shaping of a precious freeborn son is entrusted almost entirely to a man who legally owns nothing at all, not even himself. As your son grows older and begins to show real promise, the most ambitious and wealthiest families reach for the very best teachers available, traveling specialists in rhetoric and formal argument who charge enormous fees to sharpen a talented young man into a genuinely persuasive public speaker. In a city governed by open debate and public votes on nearly every important matter, the raw ability to argue persuasively is, quite literally, the ability to win, and such instruction is considered worth every coin spent on it, however steep the price. Your daughter, of course, receives none of this formal instruction, only the domestic training that will prepare her for the secluded, household-centered life awaiting her ahead. Two children raised under the very same roof, and only one of them is being handed the keys to the wider city. And speaking of the city itself, it is finally time to step outside and see it properly. Enough lounging within these walls. It is time to step out into Athens itself, and the very first thing that strikes you the moment you cross your threshold is that being wealthy has done absolutely nothing to spare you from the fact that this city, for all its glory, is genuinely a mess underfoot. The streets themselves are narrow, unpaved, winding in a way that follows no discernible logic, and reliably filthy, because any organized system of sanitation exists here more as a hopeful suggestion than as an actual functioning system. Household waste is tossed more or less wherever it happens to land. Stray dogs patrol the alleys with an almost proprietary confidence, and on a particularly hot afternoon, the smell rising from the ground can be strong enough to nearly knock a less hardened visitor off his feet entirely. You pick your way carefully through it all in your fine sandals, your cloak arranged just so, doing your very best to appear dignified while stepping gingerly over things you would very much prefer not to examine too closely. Above all of this, the gleaming marble temples sit serenely atop the great rock of the Acropolis, magnificent, spotless, and untouched by any of the mess below, like a beautiful filter laid carefully over a deeply unfiltered town. The oldest heart of Athens was never planned out on any drafting table. It simply grew organically, house by house and generation by generation, into a tangled maze of cramped lanes that twist, fork, and double back on themselves with no logic a visitor could ever hope to follow. There are no street signs anywhere in this maze, no straight organized avenues, and certainly no numbers marking the doors of individual houses. Finding an unfamiliar address in this city means asking directions repeatedly, guessing at intersections, and simply wandering until you stumble across your destination by persistence or luck. Interestingly, the people of this city know perfectly well how to lay out an orderly grid of streets when they choose to, and have done exactly that in the newer port district below the main city, where the streets run straight and orderly entirely by design. But the ancient core of Athens itself has remained a wonderfully tangled, almost medieval-feeling maze, and no amount of personal wealth can buy you a shortcut through it. You simply have to walk it, the same as everyone else. The filth in the streets functions, in its own strange way, as something of a great equalizer among the city's residents. With no proper drainage system and no organized waste collection to speak of, the streets simply absorb whatever the surrounding households push out into them. And on a still, humid summer day, the air can thicken into something you could almost lean your weight against. Rain turns the narrow lanes into thick, sucking mud. Long dry spells turn the same lanes into swirling clouds of fine dust. Animals wander freely through it all, dogs everywhere underfoot, the occasional wandering pig or donkey, each contributing its own share to the general condition of the ground beneath your feet. Your beautifully draped cloak and carefully chosen sandals are, at this point in the morning, already engaged in a quiet, losing battle against the city itself. Scattered along your route stand carved stone pillars known as herms, worth a brief mention if only because they are so genuinely strange to modern eyes. These are square stone pillars topped with a carved head of the god Hermes, and further down the shaft, a carved set of unmistakably male anatomical features, planted at doorways, boundaries, and street crossings as guardians of good luck and safe passage. To you, walking past one this morning, it is as utterly ordinary a sight as a mailbox would be to a modern pedestrian, and you would no more comment on one aloud than you would comment on a lamppost along your usual route. To a visitor arriving from a different time entirely, an entire city cheerfully decorated with these particular stone sentinels takes a bit of getting used to. At the public fountain houses scattered throughout the neighborhoods, the streets come genuinely alive with activity. These are the places where water is drawn each day, and since carrying water is considered work suited to women and to enslaved household members, the fountains naturally become busy social crossroads, full of conversation, gossip, and the constant clatter of clay water jars being filled and carried away. For many of the city's secluded women, a trip to the fountain represents one of the very few sanctioned reasons to step outside their own homes, which transforms a simple, practical errand into something closer to a genuine social event, brief, ordinary, and quietly precious all at once. And above all of it always sits the Acropolis. Lift your eyes for a moment from the mud and clutter at your feet, and there it stands, the sacred rock crowned with dazzling white marble temples, bright, clean, and serene, watching calmly over the grubby, noisy, thoroughly alive town spread out below it. It is in a very real sense the visible soul of the entire city, the answer to the unspoken question of why anyone puts up with the smell, the mud, and the maze of narrow streets in order to live here. You are wealthy. You are properly dressed. You are out in the world at last, and the world around you is loud, filthy, and utterly, vibrantly alive. Now there remains only one real question. Where does a man of your particular standing actually go first? In Athens, nearly every road worth walking eventually leads to precisely the same destination. Your first genuine stop of the day is the agora, the true beating heart of the city. Part open marketplace, part courthouse, part social gathering ground built almost entirely out of gossip and rumor. Here you can purchase fresh fish, fine pottery, imported perfume, and if you are so inclined, enslaved people at auction. You can listen to a wandering philosopher argue passionately with an ordinary fishmonger over some abstract point of logic, and you can catch up on every piece of news and rumor worth knowing before the day is finished. For a man of your wealth, the agora is far less about actual shopping, which your household staff can perfectly well handle without you, and far more about being seen, about making valuable connections, and about gently reminding the entire city that you exist and that you continue to matter. You will stroll. You will chat with acquaintances. You will pretend not to be listening closely to 3 separate conversations happening around you at once. It is networking, ancient Athenian style, and if you manage it skillfully, your reputation grows accordingly. Manage it poorly, and you become tomorrow's freshest piece of gossip instead. The agora itself is a wide, open public square ringed with grand covered walkways known as colonnades, long, shaded porches where people shelter from the sun, meet with friends, and conduct their daily business away from the direct heat. One of the most famous of these covered walkways is decorated with enormous painted scenes depicting legendary battles, and it becomes such a popular gathering spot that an entire school of philosophy eventually takes its very name from that particular porch. You could scarcely toss an olive pit in this square without striking someone holding a strong opinion, and more than enough leisure time to share it at considerable length. Everything seems to happen here at once, in one glorious, overlapping jumble. Merchants sell their wares from stalls organized loosely by trade, so the potters cluster together in one area, the fishmongers in another, the perfume sellers in yet another, each corner of the square carrying its own distinctive crowd and its own distinctive smell. Money changers sit patiently at their tables, carefully weighing coins minted in a dozen different cities against one another. Foreign resident traders who handle a great deal of the city's actual commerce haggle loudly and close their deals amid the general noise. And threaded through all of it move the idlers, the professional gossips, and the philosophers, none of whom appear to actually be purchasing anything at all. For a man of your particular standing, though, there is a subtle trap woven into the marketplace, and it is this. Actually working with your own hands here, selling goods directly, laboring for a wage, is quietly looked down upon by the aristocratic class you belong to. A true gentleman is expected to have his wealth work on his behalf through land and property, never to be caught personally sweating behind a market stall like a common tradesman. So you come to the agora primarily to be present, to be properly greeted, to be visibly important, while the actual vulgar business of buying and selling is left entirely to your enslaved staff and hired assistants. You are here to hold court among your peers, not to shop for dinner. The agora also functions as the civic center of the entire city, which means it is where real political power ultimately resides. Nearby stand the council house, where the governing council meets regularly, the courts, where citizen juries hear and decide legal cases, and the various offices of officials who keep the practical machinery of the state turning day to day. This blending of commerce and governance within a single square is no accident of city planning. In Athens, the ordinary citizen is meant to be deeply involved in both trade and politics simultaneously, and the agora places them side by side so that a man might purchase his evening meal and help reshape the direction of his entire city within the very same morning. And then there is the gossip, always the gossip. In a face-to-face world with no newspapers reaching the majority of the population, and certainly no screens of any kind, the agora functions as the city's primary news network. Reputations are made and destroyed here in real time, and everyone keeps close, careful tabs on everyone else's business. A wealthy man like yourself is a particularly favorite subject of discussion, closely watched, endlessly discussed, quietly envied, and picked apart in whispered conversation. So you smile at the right moments, you nod at the right people, you drop the right names into the right ears, and you perform your own importance like the seasoned actor you have long since become at this particular game. But there is one place within this very square where the performance suddenly turns deadly serious, where simply being a wealthy citizen stops feeling like a pleasure and starts feeling like a genuine obligation. It is time to talk about democracy. Here is the part of being a wealthy Athenian man that people love to romanticize from a comfortable historical distance, and then quietly come to regret once they actually experience it firsthand. Democracy, as practiced in this city, does not make you a passive spectator of your own government. It makes you the government itself, directly and personally, and the sheer effort involved is genuinely exhausting. Several times each month, you are expected to trek up to a nearby hillside, stand for hours under the open sun alongside thousands of your fellow citizens, and personally cast your vote on matters of war, taxation, new laws, and occasionally the decision to formally exile some particular citizen simply because he has grown uncomfortably, suspiciously popular. There are no professional politicians here in the modern sense, and no elected representatives available to handle the tedious business on your behalf. Skip the gathering without good reason, and an enslaved public official might sweep through the departing crowd dragging a rope freshly dipped in red dye. If the dye marks your cloak as you try to slip away early, you can be formally fined for your absence. Civic duty here comes with real consequences, and occasionally, a rather unwelcome laundry bill. Let us be entirely clear about who actually counts as a citizen in this system, because the membership of this particular club is small, and the door leading into it is firmly shut to most of the population. You must be an adult male, born to the right parents, free and Athenian by birth. Women, enslaved people, and the many resident foreigners who live and work within the city are all excluded entirely from this process, with no path to participation regardless of how long they have lived here or how much they contribute to the city's daily life. So this celebrated democracy, this great historical experiment in rule by the people, is in practical truth ruled by a relatively small minority of men, sitting comfortably atop a much larger population that has no formal voice in the process whatsoever. The word people, as used here, does a great deal of quiet, convenient work for those fortunate enough to be included in the club, though the demands placed upon them are genuine and relentless. The General Assembly, the great gathering of citizens, meets dozens of times throughout the year on that same open hillside, and there you do not simply select leaders to make decisions on your behalf. You decide matters yourself in person by a straightforward show of raised hands, alongside a crowd that can easily swell into the many thousands. Questions of war and peace, treaties with neighboring states, new taxes, the fate of individual military commanders, decisions about how public funds should be spent. All of it is argued out loud in the open air and ultimately settled by nothing more sophisticated than a raw count of raised arms. Then there is the Council of 500 Citizens, a body selected largely by random lottery rather than by election, whose job is to prepare the business that will eventually come before the full assembly, and to manage the daily administrative affairs of the city between larger gatherings. Here is a detail that would genuinely horrify a modern career politician. Many public offices in this city are filled not through competitive election, but through the simple drawing of lots, based on the underlying theory that any reasonably decent citizen ought to be capable of serving competently, and that a lottery system helps prevent ambitious, wealthy men from simply buying their way into positions of power. Ordinary tradesmen with no particular political ambition regularly find themselves administering significant parts of the state purely because a token or a bean happened to fall in their favor during the drawing. It is democracy taken almost gleefully to its logical extreme. And you will serve on juries too, often enormous ones, hundreds of citizens deciding a single case together with no professional judge present to guide their deliberations, and no lawyers in the modern sense representing either side. Just the accused person, the accuser, a water clock steadily ticking down each speaker's allotted time to make his case, and a large mass of your fellow citizens holding the accused person's entire fate in their collective hands. Justice in this system is loud, fast-moving, and thoroughly amateur by any modern legal standard. For a wealthy man in particular, all of this civic participation carries a special and constant edge of danger. Wealth and public prominence make you an attractive target. Certain men in this city make an entire, cynical living by threatening lawsuits against wealthy citizens, hopping simply to be quietly paid off to make the threat disappear before it reaches a courtroom. And a popular assembly gathered in a foul mood can turn against a prosperous citizen with genuinely frightening speed and force. The very same system that grants you a meaningful political voice can, on the wrong day, vote to strip you of your money, your public standing, or your place within the city entirely, with very little advance warning. So you climb the hillside, you raise your hand when called upon to vote, you deliver your carefully prepared speeches when the opportunity arises, and you keep one weary, watchful eye on the surrounding crowd throughout. Because here, in this particular arena, your fortune buys you real influence and simultaneously paints a target squarely on your back, both at the very same time. And when the long, tense business of governing your city is finally finished for the day, you head somewhere considerably more pleasant, somewhere built entirely for men exactly like yourself who happen to have a great deal of free time on their hands. With your civic duty discharged for the day, it is time for the true center of an aristocratic man's social life, the gymnasium. This is far more than a simple place to exercise. It is a sprawling complex where men train their bodies, bathe, debate philosophy, negotiate business deals, and flirt without a trace of shame, all rolled together into one gloriously unhurried institution. The great thinkers of the age teach here, the celebrated young athletes train here, and the whole complex functions essentially as a private club for citizens with time to spare, which, as a wealthy man, is more or less your entire identity. You will run, wrestle, throw the discus, and then collapse gratefully into a shaded colonnade to debate the true meaning of virtue with several other men who also, quite conveniently, do not have jobs demanding their attention. This is the good life, and on some level, you know it perfectly well. Athens is home to several of these grand complexes, situated on the leafy outskirts of the city, set among trees and running water where the air is noticeably cleaner, and the surroundings considerably more pleasant than the crowded streets you have just left behind. The most famous of these grounds lent their names to schools of philosophical thought that would outlast the physical buildings themselves by many centuries, because one of these athletic parks eventually hosted the teachings of a particularly influential philosopher, and another hosted the school founded by his most famous student. When you hear grand, weighty names attached to entire schools of thought later in history, it is worth remembering that the actual roots of some of them trace back quite literally to an athletic park where men gathered to work up a sweat and talk casually until, almost by accident, the conversation became something close to genuine wisdom. The heart of the complex is the wrestling ground itself, an open courtyard ringed with smaller rooms where men train under the watchful eye of a hired coach. Around this central space spread changing rooms, oiling rooms, dusting rooms, washing areas, and shaded covered walkways designed for the essential business of standing about and talking at length. The physical training conducted here is genuinely demanding, running, wrestling, jumping, and throwing both the discus and the javelin, all events the wider culture holds in high esteem. But the building itself is designed just as much for unhurried lounging as for actual physical labor. Because here is the honest truth of the matter. For a wealthy man of leisure, the gymnasium functions less as a fitness center in the modern sense and more as an exclusive private club. It is the place where the genuinely important men of the city gather each and every day to see and be seen by one another. Business deals are quietly arranged beneath its colonnades. Political alliances are forged between sets of exercise. Reputations rise and fall within its walls. If you wanted to know who truly mattered in Athens on any given day, and what those men were actually thinking, you did not read about it anywhere. You came to the gymnasium yourself and joined the conversation directly, freshly oiled and pleasantly out of breath. And then, naturally, there is the thinking that happens here. These shaded grounds become the natural gathering place of philosophers, because where else in the city would you reliably find a permanent crowd of educated, unhurried men with nothing pressing demanding their attention, and a deep, genuine fondness for lengthy argument? Teachers stroll the covered walkways trailed by small groups of eager students. Difficult questions get chewed over patiently for hours at a stretch, and some of the most consequential ideas in the entire history of human thought were first tossed casually around by men who had come to these grounds ostensibly to work on their wrestling technique. It is a strange and genuinely wonderful thing to sit with, once you notice it. Body and mind are not treated here as rivals competing for a man's limited attention, but rather as partners, both worthy of careful training, both to be perfected together in the very same green and pleasant setting. A properly cultivated Athenian gentleman is meant to be strong and intellectually sharp at once, physically fit and genuinely wise, and the gymnasium is precisely where he becomes both simultaneously. So you arrive at the grounds, you greet your fellow citizens warmly, and you prepare to begin your training. But before you can actually begin, there is the small matter of the dress code to consider, which is to say, the complete and entirely cheerful absence of one. Now, about that dress code at the gymnasium, there simply is not one. The very word for gymnasium in this language derives from the Greek term for being naked, and the people of this city take that particular etymology extremely literally. Men exercise here completely nude, gleaming with fresh olive oil, entirely unbothered in a manner that would get a person swiftly arrested almost anywhere in the modern world. To the Athenians, a well-trained male body is considered a genuine thing of beauty, a favorite subject for sculptors working across the city, and a real source of civic pride. So parading that trained body around while hurling a javelin feels, to everyone present, perfectly natural and entirely unremarkable. You strip down, oil yourself thoroughly, and join in the training, trying very hard to behave as though this entire arrangement is completely ordinary, because to everyone standing around you, it genuinely is. Between the oil, the dust, the sun, and the accumulating sweat, you are going to need that curved bronze scraping tool again very soon. To understand fully why an entire civilization decided that clothing was entirely optional at the gymnasium, it helps to understand how the Greeks feel about the human body more broadly. They do not regard a fit, healthy physical form as something shameful to be hidden away from view. They regard it instead as a genuine achievement, visible evidence of discipline, good health, and strong character made physically apparent for all to see. A man who has trained his body carefully into strength and grace has something in his view genuinely worth displaying openly, and the gymnasium serves as the natural stage for exactly that display. The whole ritual carries its own steady rhythm. First, you remove your clothing entirely and set it carefully aside. Then you rub yourself down thoroughly with olive oil, work deeply into the skin until it shines, a process believed to warm the muscles properly, protect the skin from the sun, and simply look magnificent to onlookers. Some men then dust a fine layer of powder over the oil, providing a better grip for wrestling matches and a small additional shield against the harsh sun overhead. By the time you actually step out to begin training, you are oiled, lightly dusted, gleaming, and entirely undressed, and so, notably, is every single other man present in the complex that morning, from the eager teenage newcomer to the graying elder statesman standing nearby. This, incidentally, is where those beautifully idealized marble statues you might picture hanging in a modern museum actually originate. Sculptors studied these training grounds obsessively, carefully observing real bodies in genuine motion, learning precisely how muscle shifts beneath skin and how balance holds during a difficult throw, and then translating everything they observed into carved stone. The famous idealized athletes frozen mid-throw or mid-stride that survived from this era were not simply invented from pure imagination. They were, in a very real sense, portraits of a culture that spent its afternoons genuinely watching the human body perform impressive feats in the open air. There is, naturally, a firm line drawn around exactly who gets to be present for all of this. The gymnasium is a strictly male world, closed entirely to respectable women, whether as participants or even as onlookers. This is the domain of the citizen man, another one of those distinct spaces, like the evening drinking party and the political assembly, where the important business of male social life unfolds well out of any female sight whatsoever. The women of your own household are spinning wool quietly upstairs at this very moment while you and your peers throw the discus together in bright sunshine, wearing nothing at all beyond a fresh coat of olive oil. For all the genuine strangeness of this custom to modern eyes, there is something almost innocent buried within the Greek attitude toward the body, a matter-of-fact ease that later historical periods would largely lose entirely. Nakedness at the gymnasium carries no shock value and no shame in this particular cultural context. It is simply understood as the correct, practical way to exercise properly, as unremarkable to them as lacing up running shoes might be to a modern athlete. If anything, doing it any other way would strike them as the genuinely strange choice. So you train hard, you sweat freely, you shine under the sun, and by the time your session ends, you are coated head to toe in a thick, honest paste of oil, dust, and real physical effort, which naturally leaves one obvious and rather pressing problem. All of that has to come off again somehow, and getting properly clean in this particular world is nothing at all like simply turning on a modern tap. Speaking of which, all that accumulated oil and dust does have to come off eventually, and this is where getting clean becomes something of an athletic event in its own right. There are public bathing basins available at the gymnasium itself, but the real work of getting clean happens through scraping. You, or more likely an enslaved attendant working on your behalf, drag the curved bronze strigil firmly across your skin, peeling away the accumulated mixture of oil, sweat, and grime in long, deeply satisfying, faintly revolting strips. Wealthy men take enormous pride in this particular ritual, and remarkably, the scraped-off residue from especially famous athletes is sometimes collected afterward and sold to admirers, because apparently some things about human nature simply never change across the centuries. A splash of cold water, a brisk final rub-down, and one last fresh coat of perfumed oil, and you emerge from the whole process clean, gleaming and smelling once again faintly of an expensive, fragrant salad. You feel, quite frankly, magnificent. The strigil itself deserves a proper introduction here, as the true unsung hero of ancient hygiene. It is a curved blade of bronze or iron, shaped somewhat like a hook or an elongated comma, with a handle at one end and a smooth, gently curved channel running the length of its blade. You press the curved edge firmly against your skin and draw it steadily along your arm, your leg, your back, and it plows up the accumulated oil and everything caught within it, funneling the entire grim harvest cleanly off your body and onto the ground below. Done skillfully, it leaves you genuinely clean. Done clumsily, it leaves you scratched, irritated, and thoroughly annoyed. And here is a detail that never fails to astonish modern listeners. The greasy, sweat-soaked residue scraped from the bodies of particularly famous athletes was not simply discarded after use. It was carefully collected, bottled, and sold to eager buyers, because people in this era genuinely believed that the sweat and oil of a celebrated champion carried some measure of healing or strengthening properties, useful when applied elsewhere as a kind of medicine or ointment. Somewhere across this very city right now, a wealthy man is likely rubbing the bottled residue of a famous wrestler onto a sore knee and paying good money for the privilege of doing so. The impulse to purchase a small physical piece of the famous, it turns out, is apparently far older than anyone might have guessed. For the actual water portion of getting clean, your available options remain fairly humble throughout this entire world. At both the gymnasium and back home, there are simple basins and shallow troughs for splashing and rinsing, and the water within them is very often cold, since heating any significant quantity of water represents a genuine amount of labor for someone in your household. You do not luxuriate here beneath any warm, cascading shower. You douse yourself briskly, scrub thoroughly, and move on with your day, an experience closer to rinsing off after an unplanned swim than to soaking leisurely in a modern spa. Public bathhouses do exist elsewhere in the city, offering genuinely warmer, more comfortable water and a place to properly linger for a while. But your wider society sends rather mixed messages about this particular indulgence, because the more conservative voices among your peers regard frequent hot bathing as a soft, self-indulgent habit, precisely the sort of thing that makes a man weak and insufficiently manly. The truly rugged Greek, they insist with obvious pride, makes do entirely with cold water, and does not lie about steaming himself gently like some pampered Easterner. Naturally, plenty of ordinary people enjoy the warm baths regardless of this criticism, and simply let the moralists complain quietly into their own cold basins. Once the scraping and rinsing are both finally complete, you seal the entire ritual by anointing yourself once more, this time with fresh, clean, perfumed oil. It moisturizes your skin thoroughly, guards effectively against the dry midday heat, and leaves you smelling pleasantly fragrant for the remainder of the afternoon. It neatly explains, too, exactly why wealthy households like your own go through such enormous quantities of the stuff. Olive oil serves here as both the beginning and the end of every single wash, functioning as the ancient world soap and lotion combined into one single, slightly curious package. So you finish this portion of your day clean, glowing, freshly scented, and quietly pleased with your own appearance. And now that your body is in perfect order once again, your attention naturally turns toward the surface of things more broadly, toward appearance, toward public display, toward the endless and remarkably serious social game of looking exactly as wealthy as you genuinely are. Feeling thoroughly refreshed after your training and washing, you now turn your attention to the serious business of looking every bit as prosperous as you actually are. For men in this culture, this is always a delicate balancing act, because Athens officially prizes restraint and moderation while simultaneously, unofficially, adoring genuine displays of wealth and status. Your outer cloak is crafted from the finest available wool, your sandals are well made by a skilled craftsman, and your beard is carefully shaped and maintained, because a proper adult man wears his beard the way a modern executive might wear an expensive watch, as a quiet, deliberate signal of status. For the women of your household, this kind of display extends considerably further, involving gold jewelry, elaborate earrings, intricately arranged hairstyles, and cosmetics, including a lead-based white powder applied to the skin that is fashionable, expensive, and though nobody in this era fully understands it yet, quietly poisonous. Beauty in this world always carries some kind of price, and here, that price is occasionally paid in a woman's own long-term health. Still, you look every bit the part today, and in this particular city, looking the part is very nearly half the entire battle. The real trick for a wealthy man is learning to look magnificent while carefully pretending you have barely tried at all. Athens genuinely prizes the idea of moderation in public life, and views obvious, showy extravagance in a man as somewhat distasteful, the unmistakable mark of someone trying too hard, or worse, someone whose money is uncomfortably new. So any display of wealth must remain quiet, knowing, understated rather than gaudy, yet unmistakably perfect in its execution. The wool of your cloak is simply, quietly, the finest available in the market. Your sandals are simply the best crafted a skilled cobbler can produce. You carry yourself with the calm, unhurried ease of a man who has genuinely never once worried about anything in his life, and that carefully cultivated ease is itself, in a very real sense, the single most expensive thing you are wearing today. A few small, deliberate touches do most of the actual talking for you. A well-shaped beard signals maturity and personal dignity at a glance. A fine walking staff lends an air of quiet authority as you move through the streets. A signet ring, carved with your own personal seal, functions as both decorative jewelry and a practical tool, used to press your unique mark into warm wax or clay to formally seal letters and important documents. A small emblem announcing that you are a man important enough to have things genuinely worth sealing. These represent the understated, restrained flourishes of male wealth, quiet on the surface, yet unmistakably boastful just beneath it. For the women of your household, the rules governing display relax considerably, and the resulting display grows noticeably bolder, though of course it happens largely outside public view, confined mostly to private gatherings and religious festivals. Gold gleams at the ear, the wrist, and the throat. Hair is oiled, carefully curled, and arranged into elaborate styles held in place with decorative pins and bands, and the face itself receives the full, careful attention of ancient cosmetic practices, which is precisely where matters take a genuinely alarming turn. The most prized look among fashionable women is pale, untanned skin, a visible sign that a woman has never had to labor outdoors beneath the sun like a common field worker. To achieve this fashionable pallor, women apply a fine white powder made using lead, which works beautifully as a cosmetic and is, at the very same time, slowly and steadily toxic, seeping its poison gradually into the very women trying hardest to appear beautiful by the standards of their time. Cheeks and lips, by contrast, are reddened using safer plant-based dyes. Eyebrows are darkened, and a single continuous brow spanning the whole forehead is, somewhat surprisingly to modern taste, considered genuinely admirable. Beauty here, in other words, could quite literally cost a woman her long-term health, one fashionable application at a time. Mirrors complete this elaborate daily ritual, though not the clear glass mirrors familiar to a modern household. These are simple discs of carefully polished bronze, offering back a dim, golden, somewhat forgiving reflection rather than a sharp, clear image. A woman checks her elaborate handiwork in this soft, blurred metal surface, seeing perhaps a gentler, kinder version of herself than any modern mirror would ever honestly allow her to see. Underneath all of this careful ritual runs a single, quiet, consistent truth. Every pin, every ring, every drop of perfume, every dangerous dab of white lead powder carries the very same underlying message. This household possesses genuine money, and it is not remotely afraid to show it, tastefully of course, and always within the careful bounds of what this particular society considers appropriate restraint. Appearance here is never simply personal vanity for its own sake. It functions instead as reputation made visibly, tangibly real for anyone paying attention. And speaking of appetites, both the social kind and the entirely literal kind, all of this careful preening has carried you steadily toward the middle of the day, and a wealthy man certainly does not skip his midday meal. All this grooming and unhurried civic strolling has, quite naturally, made you genuinely hungry by now. So let us turn to the subject of lunch, which the Greeks treat as a remarkably light and unfussy affair compared to the grand evening meal still to come. Even within a household as wealthy as your own, the midday meal remains fairly simple in composition: bread, olives, cheese, figs, perhaps a bit of dried fish or a handful of fresh vegetables, all eaten without a great deal of ceremony surrounding it. The wider culture genuinely admires moderation at the table, at least in theory, and regards outright gluttony as the unmistakable mark of either a barbarian or a fool with poor self-control. Naturally, theory and actual daily practice do not always shake hands quite so neatly, and the real culinary indulgence of the day is always carefully reserved for the evening ahead. For now, though, you eat lightly, virtuously, and with the smug, private satisfaction of a man who knows a much larger, far more indulgent meal is coming later, while fully intending to pretend otherwise to anyone watching. The foundation of nearly every meal in this culture, lunch included, is bread, with everything else arranged carefully around it as a supporting element. The Greeks even maintain a particular way of conceptually dividing their food into two distinct categories. There is the staple, the bread and grain that fills your stomach and performs the genuinely serious work of keeping you properly fed and functional. And there is the relish, everything flavorful you eat on top of or alongside that staple to make the endless bread genuinely interesting to eat, meal after meal. The staple keeps you alive through the day. The relish keeps you reasonably happy while doing so. A great deal of Greek daily eating amounts in practice to the ongoing art of finding a good enough relish to make an otherwise endless diet of bread genuinely bearable over time. Your midday relishes today are modest and thoroughly familiar. the very sort of foods a modern physician would likely applaud without hesitation. Glistening, salty olives. Cheese, often made from goat's or sheep's milk depending on the season. Figs, fresh when in season or carefully dried for the rest of the year. So beloved throughout the region that Athenians are half convinced their local figs are simply the finest in the entire known world, and they will happily say so at every possible opportunity that presents itself. A bit of dried or lightly salted fish rounds out the plate, along with onions, garlic, and whatever fresh vegetables happen to be in season that week, all washed down with wine diluted generously with water, because it is, after all, the middle of the day, and you remain, above all else, a properly civilized man. What you will not find on your table at lunch, or indeed at most ordinary meals throughout the year, is a large slab of meat. Fresh meat is genuinely rare in the everyday Greek diet of this era, and for the majority of the population, it remains closely tied to religious sacrifice, eaten primarily on festival days when animals are formally offered to the gods, and the resulting meat is then shared out afterward among the assembled people. Even within a wealthy household like your own, everyday dining leans far more heavily on bread, olive oil, wine, olives, and fish than on any substantial roasts or cuts of meat. The popular modern image of ancient banquets groaning beneath mountains of meat is, on any ordinary day at least, considerably closer to fantasy than to lived historical fact. The Greeks speak about their own eating habits with a certain quiet pride, contrasting their own supposed simplicity and self-discipline against the imagined excess of foreign peoples, whom they love to picture indulging themselves into total loss of self-control. To eat plainly and with genuine moderation is, in the Greek telling of their own culture, a clear sign of discipline and strong character, proof that a man has mastered his own base desires rather than being ruled helplessly by them. It is, in many ways, a flattering story this culture tells about itself. And like most such convenient stories, it holds up remarkably well right up until the evening meal begins, because the moderation on display throughout the day is, in large part, simply a daytime performance. The light breakfast, the modest midday lunch, all the earnest talk of self-control, together set the stage carefully for the evening ahead, when wealthy men gather together to eat well, drink deeply, and indulge themselves properly among close friends. The restraint practiced throughout the day is, in a very real sense, simply clearing room for the genuine pleasures still to come after dark. So you finish your simple, sensible lunch today, olives, bread, and a modest splash of watered wine, the very picture of Greek moderation on public display. And then, being a genuinely wealthy man, you begin to think ahead toward the evening, because a proper feast most certainly does not assemble itself without careful planning and preparation. It is time to go shopping for the truly good stuff, and the good stuff, it turns out, is an entire world unto itself. Since your evening feast will certainly not assemble itself, let us wander now through the wider world of luxury food, because this is precisely where the truly wealthy separate themselves from everyone else in the city. The great culinary obsession of this entire society is fish, specifically fine, fresh fish, prized and priced so highly that a particularly good catch arriving at the market can very nearly cause a small stampede among eager buyers. Wealthy Athenians compete openly over rare delicacies, imported eels, exotic seasonings, fine honey, and wine sourced from famous, prestigious regions, in much the same way modern people might compete over an impossible restaurant reservation. Your household cook, most likely an enslaved specialist whose particular skill directly reflects on your own personal status, will transform these carefully selected treasures into a meal designed purely to impress your assembled guests. You are not simply buying dinner tonight. You are, in a very real sense, buying the right to be the subject of admiring conversation tomorrow. This fish obsession is genuinely not an exaggeration on our part, and it remains one of the strangest, most delightful details of this particular world. Fine, fresh fish stands as the ultimate luxury food in Athenian society, more coveted by far than almost any cut of meat, and the culture has developed its own specific term for the sort of man who spends recklessly and drools shamelessly at the mere sight of a particularly good catch. A fish glutton, a man who loses all sense of personal dignity at the sight of a fine eel, becomes something of a stock comic figure in the popular theater of the day. Poets and playwrights joke endlessly about wealthy men fighting openly over the best available catch, bankrupting themselves entirely for one particularly fine specimen, and hovering anxiously around the fish stalls like moths circling a flame. The single most legendary delicacy of all is the eel, especially the great fat eels harvested from a particular lake to the north, praised by comic poets in language usually reserved for royalty. A truly fine eel is spoken of with something approaching genuine reverence, wrapped carefully in beet leaves, cooked with real attention and care, and served proudly as the crowning glory of an entire feast. To place such a dish before your assembled guests is to announce, without needing to say a single word, that your household spares no expense whatsoever and knows precisely what the finest things in life actually are. Beyond fish, the wealthy of this city compete across an entire landscape of imported and genuinely rare goods. Honey, the great sweetener of a world that has never known refined sugar, is prized especially from certain particular regions above all others. Spices and seasonings are carried in from distant lands across the Mediterranean. Rich cheeses, carefully chosen cuts, rare seasonal fruits, and above all, wine sourced from the specific islands and coastal regions carrying the very best reputations, whose names stamped on a jar mean instant, unmistakable prestige to any knowledgeable guest. Where exactly your food and drink originates matters enormously in this social game, and a genuinely knowledgeable host chooses his sources with the same careful attention a collector might bring to choosing fine art. Presiding over the transformation of these carefully gathered treasures into an actual finished meal is your cook, and within a genuinely grand household, the cook is a figure of real, tangible importance. Often an enslaved specialist possessing considerable culinary skill, sometimes hired out specifically for particularly great occasions, a celebrated cook can quite literally make or break an entire feast, and along with it, a host's carefully cultivated reputation. In the popular comedies of this era, cooks strut about on stage as boastful comic geniuses, lecturing everyone within earshot on the deep philosophy of the perfect dish, absurdly proud of their own skill, and yet secretly, genuinely indispensable to their employer's social standing. The joke lands precisely because it contains a real, uncomfortable truth. A wealthy man's glory at his own dinner table ultimately rests on the considerable talent of a man he legally owns as property. And that, in the end, is the quiet engine humming beneath all of this apparent abundance. Every rare fish, every jar of prized honey, every bottle of wine from a famous vineyard functions as a form of communication, a carefully constructed message about exactly who you are and precisely how high you stand within Athenian society. The feast tonight is never simply about eating a good meal. It is about display, quiet competition, and the endless, restless jostling for status among men who already possess nearly everything and still, somehow, always want just a little more admiration from the man reclining on the next couch over. So your enslaved household staff carry the treasures of the marketplace home, and your kitchen slowly begins to fill with the rich smells of the evening still to come. But before we reach the party itself, there remains one particular ingredient so genuinely central to the whole evening, so thoroughly wrapped in ritual and unwritten rule, that it deserves an entire segment devoted to itself. We need to talk properly about wine. Before the party can truly begin tonight, we must first discuss the single most important rule governing Greek drinking, a rule the wider culture genuinely regards as a mark of civilization itself. You simply do not drink your wine straight. Only barbarians, the Athenians insist with real confidence, gulp down unmixed wine like animals crowded around a trough. A properly civilized Greek man mixes his wine carefully with water in a large communal bowl known as a crater, typically diluting it rather heavily by modern standards, and drinks the resulting mixture slowly across many hours of genuinely good conversation. The underlying goal of the entire evening is a pleasant, sociable warmth, not a complete loss of control. Though naturally, as the night wears steadily on, the mixtures do tend to grow gradually stronger, and the debates around the room grow correspondingly louder and more animated. So you sip carefully, you pace yourself deliberately, and you remember throughout that the Greeks take real, genuine pride in having invented moderation, and then immediately set about testing its outer limits with considerable enthusiasm. The crater itself sits at the very physical center of tonight's gathering, a wide-bellied bowl in which wine and water are carefully blended together before a single guest takes even one sip. From this central bowl, servers fill each guest's individual drinking cup, so that everyone present at the party drinks from precisely the same shared mixture, at precisely the same strength, in a kind of quiet liquid equality that runs through the whole evening. Nobody pours out his own private, stronger measure on the side. The entire room rises and falls together, one shared bowl at a time, which is, when you actually stop to consider it, a rather lovely way to structure an evening among friends. The dilution involved here is genuinely heavy by any modern standard. Wine is routinely cut with considerably more water than wine itself, often several parts water measured against a single part wine, so that what you actually end up drinking throughout the evening is closer to a mildly flavored refreshment than to anything resembling a strong modern drink. To take your wine with only a small amount of added water is considered somewhat daring behavior at a gathering like tonight's, and to take it with no water added at all is practically read by everyone present as a public confession that you have entirely lost your grip on civilized behavior. The Greeks genuinely believe that unmixed wine can drive a man toward outright madness, and they tell cautionary stories of famous historical figures who ruined themselves entirely by drinking in this reckless, foreign manner. Watching carefully over the exact ratio for the entire evening is a figure of real, temporary authority, a master of the drinking chosen from among tonight's assembled guests to formally run the party. He decides how strong each successive mixture in the crater should be, how quickly the cups should circulate around the room, and precisely how far the night should be allowed to go before things wind down. Under a genuinely wise master of the evening, the whole gathering stays warm, witty, and pleasantly controlled throughout. Under a more reckless one, the mixtures creep steadily stronger as the hours pass, and the party gradually tips over into real chaos. He holds, in a very real sense, the entire mood of the room in the careful tilt of a single large bowl. The wine itself arrives tonight in several distinct grades, and your particular choice as host speaks volumes about your household to every guest present. The most admired vintages come from certain specific islands and coastal regions, whose names alone carry instant, unmistakable prestige, dark, sweet, and prized well above all others available in the market. Lesser, more ordinary wines fill ordinary cups on ordinary days throughout the rest of the year. Some wines served tonight might be flavored with resin, various herbs, honey, or even seawater, tastes that range from the genuinely delightful to the frankly alarming by any modern palate standards. And because there is no reliable way in this era to preserve wine indefinitely, much of what you drink tonight is relatively young, sweet, and notably strong. All the more reason to carefully tame it with water before it has the chance to tame you instead. Above all else, wine in this culture carries the living presence of a particular god. It belongs, in a very real spiritual sense, to Dionysus, the deity of wine, of uninhibited revelry, and of the joyful, sanctioned loss of ordinary self-control. And so to drink tonight is, in a small but genuine way, to actively honor him. Before the serious drinking of the evening truly begins, a small portion of wine is deliberately poured out as a formal offering to the gods, a small splash tipped from each cup in a gesture of thanks and quiet respect. Even your evening indulgence carries this sacred dimension, this small nod toward the divine powers believed to be watching closely over the feast. So the crater is filled, the water carefully added, the god properly honored, and the cups begin their slow, steady circuit around the room. Everything necessary is now finally in place. The couches stand ready. The wine is properly mixed. The night stretches invitingly ahead of you. It is time, at long last, for the true crown jewel of your entire glittering existence. It is time for the symposium to begin. And now, the crown jewel of aristocratic social life in this city, the symposium itself. This is the exclusive after-dinner drinking party held in that same special room we mentioned earlier, where men recline together on couches arranged carefully along the walls, propped comfortably on one elbow, and give themselves over fully to wine, conversation, and organized entertainment for the remainder of the evening. Reclining to drink is itself considered a genuine status symbol here, a quiet way of announcing that you are far too refined and leisured to sit upright at a table like some common laborer might. The guests present tonight are all men. The overall mood of the evening can range anywhere from lofty philosophical discussion to absolute chaos, depending entirely on how late the hour has grown, and the whole event follows customs every bit as elaborate as any modern formal dinner party, only with considerably more wine involved and notably fewer actual chairs in the room. You take your assigned couch for the evening, settle in comfortably, and brace yourself, because this is going to be a genuinely long night ahead. The evening unfolds across two distinct acts, and it is important to keep them properly separated in your mind. First comes the actual meal itself, the eating portion, which is handled relatively briskly and without excessive ceremony. Then, once the food has been cleared away entirely, the tables wiped clean, and the proper ritual offerings made to the gods, comes the drinking party proper, the symposium in its truest sense, which represents the actual point of the entire evening's exercise. The Greeks deliberately do not mix serious eating and serious drinking together in the same stretch of time. They finish one activity completely and then devote themselves fully to the other, rather like a well-structured show built around a clear intermission separating its distinct acts. The setting tonight is that same finest room in your entire home, built specifically for exactly this purpose. Couches line every wall, usually an odd number of them by careful tradition, each holding one or occasionally two reclining guests, arranged deliberately so that everyone present can see and easily converse with everyone else in the room. You lie comfortably on your left elbow throughout the evening, your cup always within easy reach, cushions supporting your back, in a posture that is simultaneously comfortable, genuinely sociable, and pointedly, deliberately aristocratic. Reclining to drink is a luxury custom, originally borrowed from cultures further east and embraced here with real enthusiasm, and it marks you clearly as a man of genuine leisure and refinement, someone who has never once in his life needed to eat standing up out of simple practical necessity. Ritual formally opens tonight's proceedings. Garlands woven from flowers or fresh leaves are passed carefully around the room and worn on the head throughout the evening. Perfumes are shared generously among the guests, and further offerings of wine are poured out to the gods with particular honor reserved for Dionysus, whose gift fills the great central bowl at the heart of the room. Songs might be sung in praise of the divine before the more human business of the evening properly begins. Only once the gods have been thoroughly and properly thanked, and the overall mood of the room has been carefully set, does the chosen master of the drinking formally take charge, and the cups finally begin their steady movement around the room. What actually happens next depends entirely on the particular company gathered tonight and on the hour. At its very finest, the symposium represents one of the genuine glories of Greek civilization as a whole, a gathering where the sharpest minds of the entire city recline comfortably together and talk, genuinely talk, about love, justice, beauty, politics, and the deeper meaning of a well-lived life, with the wine steadily loosening tongues while simultaneously sharpening collective wit in equal measure. Some of the most celebrated philosophical works to survive from this era are structured explicitly around exactly such an evening, a small group of clever, articulate men passing ideas freely around the room, along with the shared cup. This represents conversation raised genuinely to the level of a true art form. At the other extreme entirely, that very same party can dissolve just as easily into glorious disorder as the successive mixtures grow stronger and ordinary discipline gradually slips away, ending eventually in loud, off-key songs, wild improvised games, and grown men stumbling out unsteadily into the dark streets long after they really should have already gone home for the night. Between these two poles lies every possible shade of evening imaginable, and no guest arriving at the very start of a symposium can ever be entirely certain in advance which particular kind of night actually lies ahead of him. What remains certain, though, is the composition of the company and its firm limits. This is a gathering of citizen men exclusively, your close peers and your occasional rivals, and the respectable women of your own household are nowhere to be seen tonight. Yet the room will not remain entirely empty of skill, of music, or of performing voices raised in entertainment, because a proper symposium is never simply a group of men drinking together in total silence. It comes always with genuine entertainment woven throughout, and that entertainment is a world genuinely worth exploring in its own right. A symposium tonight is never simply about drinking alone. It functions as a genuine performance, and every single guest present is expected to contribute something meaningful to the evening. There are drinking games woven throughout, the most famous by far being a game where pleasantly tipsy men fling the last dregs of wine remaining in their cups at a designated target across the room. A game exactly as messy in practice as it sounds, and considered, remarkably, the absolute height of good fun by everyone involved. There is music provided by hired performers throughout the evening, riddles posed and answered, poetry recited entirely from memory, and long, winding debates about love, politics, and virtue that can turn either genuinely brilliant or thoroughly unbearable, depending heavily on exactly how many bowls of wine have already been drained by that point in the night. As host tonight, your job is to keep the wine flowing steadily and the overall mood alive throughout. As a guest at someone else's symposium, your job is to be clever, charming, and, ideally, still upright by the time the evening finally concludes. Let us start with that particular flinging game, because it may genuinely be the single most distinctly Greek game ever invented by anyone. Each drinker carefully saves the very last splash of wine remaining in the bottom of his cup, then flings it across the room with a practiced flick of the wrist toward a designated target, often a small disc carefully balanced on a stand that clatters down loudly with a satisfying ring whenever it is struck accurately. Men wager freely on their own aim, call out the names of those they particularly favor as they throw, and take this entire silly business remarkably, genuinely seriously throughout the evening. It amounts to a form of darts, essentially, played using wine instead of proper darts, and genuinely terrible for the surrounding walls, yet grown men throughout this culture take real, quiet pride in their personal throwing technique. Then there is the music, which fills the room steadily from beginning to end of the evening. Hired performers are regularly brought into play, most commonly a piercing double-piped reed instrument whose distinctive sound wins through nearly every gathering of this kind, alongside the gentler, more melodic notes of the lyre. These musicians and dancers performing tonight are, for the most part, enslaved or hired entertainers whose own lives are considerably more precarious than anything the reclining guests around them will ever personally experience. It is a hard truth sitting quietly beneath all the festivity, and one genuinely worth remembering even as the party glitters warmly around you. Their skill on display tonight is entirely real. Their circumstances are not remotely their own to control, and the room enjoys the former while largely, comfortably ignoring the latter. The guests themselves become performers too as the evening wears on, and this particular detail tends to surprise people learning about it for the first time. You are genuinely expected to sing when your turn comes around. As the evening progresses, a small branch of myrtle might be passed from couch to couch around the room, and whoever happens to be holding it when the music pauses is expected to offer up a song, a scrap of remembered verse, a clever saying, or a witty toast before passing the branch onward to the next guest. These short, sharp drinking songs, often composed on the spot, represent a genuine art form in their own right, and a man who cannot manage his turn gracefully is quietly, silently marked down by his peers as dull company. Your entire boyhood education in poetry and music, all those long hours spent memorizing Homer and learning the lyre, exists in large part for precisely this moment tonight. Riddles and various word games fill the natural gaps in conversation throughout the evening, sometimes purely playful, sometimes fiercely competitive between rival guests. One man poses a riddle or begins a line of verse, and the next guest is challenged to answer it correctly, complete it cleverly, or cap it with something even better, the whole table steadily sharpening its collective wit against itself as the night wears on. To lose such an exchange might mean accepting a small forfeit, often something comic, draining a full cup in one single go, or performing some small foolish act for the amusement of everyone else present. It amounts to learning, drinking, and showing off, all braided seamlessly together into the very same golden evening, and weaving quietly through all of it runs the genuine conversation, which represents the true heart of the entire gathering. Between the songs, the games, and the occasional flying wine, men argue passionately, joke freely, and philosophize together. And on the very best nights, the conversation genuinely soars into something worth remembering for years afterward. This represents the whole underlying promise of the symposium, that wine, wit, and good company together might just occasionally produce something close to genuine wisdom. But the room tonight holds one more presence we have circled around without yet properly naming, the only women actually permitted at this particular feast of men, and they deserve our full attention now. You may have noticed something rather curious about tonight's gathering already. There are, technically, no respectable women present at all, and yet there are, quite clearly, women in the room. These are the heterae, a distinct class of educated, financially independent companions who attend gatherings exactly like this one, when wives and daughters simply cannot, and would not be present. Unlike most women living in Athens, a hetera can be genuinely witty, well-read, and skilled in music, capable of holding her own confidently in conversation with the most powerful men present, in a wider society that otherwise grants women almost no public voice whatsoever. Their individual lives are complicated and often genuinely precarious, and it would be dishonest of us to romanticize their circumstances. But within the narrow, wine-soaked world of tonight's symposium, they are frequently, unmistakably the sharpest minds present in the entire room. You may find yourself, to your own quiet embarrassment, realizing that the single most interesting person at your own party tonight is precisely the kind of woman your own city has deliberately refused to educate. To understand what a hetera actually represents, you have to understand a particular strange gap running through the lives of Athenian men generally. Your own wife is kept carefully secluded, largely uneducated in the practical ways of public life, and firmly excluded from your dinner parties and your world of open intellectual debate. This arrangement leaves behind a peculiar hole in the social fabric. Men genuinely want female company that can be talked with directly, not merely admired silently from across a room. Company capable of matching them in genuine wit, discussing poetry with real understanding, following a complex argument closely, and holding a room's attention on its own merits. Since respectable society firmly forbids exactly this from wives and daughters, an entirely separate class of women has arisen over time specifically to fill that gap, occupying a social role with genuinely no clean modern equivalent. Some heterae are highly cultivated indeed, skilled in music and conversation, celebrated openly for their cleverness, and actively sought after by the most prominent men across the entire city. A small number become genuinely famous, remembered by name for their wit, their beauty, or their real influence over powerful public figures, moving comfortably through social circles that no ordinary Athenian wife could ever hope to enter. In a wider world that silences women almost entirely from public life, a small handful of them become genuine legends, precisely for having a real, audible voice. But it would be a serious mistake to paint this particular life as purely glamorous or genuinely free, and basic honesty demands we do not do so here. These are women living entirely outside the formal protections that marriage, however confining it might be, offers to other women in this society. Their security depends entirely on their personal charm, their carefully built reputation, and the ongoing favor of men who can withdraw that favor at any moment they choose. Many did not actually choose this particular role for themselves. Many more never managed to escape it once entered, and the small number of celebrated names stand atop a much larger number of women whose actual lives were simply hard, difficult, and left almost entirely unrecorded by history. The independence on display comes at a steep, constant, ongoing price. The deep irony sitting at the very center of this entire arrangement is genuinely worth pausing on. Athens takes its own daughters and wives and deliberately shuts them away from education, from public conversation, from any real engagement with the life of the mind, insisting all the while that this represents genuine virtue. Then, finding its own dinner parties rather dull without a genuinely clever woman present to enliven the conversation, the very same society turns to a separate class of women, actively permits and even encourages them to be witty and learned, and prizes them specifically for exactly the qualities it firmly forbids in everyone else. The city builds a careful wall around female intelligence, and then quietly pays good money to visit that same intelligence on the other side of the wall it built. So as you recline tonight at your own symposium, listening to a hetera turn a clever phrase more elegantly than any man currently at the table, you are, in a real sense, watching the central contradiction of your entire world made vividly flesh right in front of you. She stands as living proof that the women of Athens could genuinely have become anything at all, given a fair chance, and simultaneously as proof of exactly how firmly that chance has been denied to nearly all of them. It is a genuinely sobering thought to hold quietly over a cup of watered wine, and it leads us rather naturally back to the woman currently waiting upstairs in your own home, and to how she actually came to be your wife in the very first place. Let us rewind for a moment from the party back to something you actually had remarkably little say in yourself, your own marriage. Among wealthy families like yours, marriage functions primarily as a business arrangement, negotiated carefully between two households, centered on property, useful alliance, and the production of legitimate heirs, with romance considered, at best, a pleasant bonus that might or might not eventually develop. Your bride was very likely still a teenager on her wedding day, while you were already a fully grown adult man well established in your own life. The entire match was arranged directly by her father, and a formal dowry changed hands to properly seal the agreement between the two families. It was entirely possible, and not even unusual, to meet your own future wife properly for the very first time on your actual wedding day itself. The Greeks of this era do not marry primarily for love. They marry for the sake of the household and its continued future, and love, if it ever arrives at all, is generally expected to develop quietly sometime after the practical paperwork has already been settled. Romantic, this arrangement genuinely is not. Efficient, by the standards of the time, it very much is. The whole affair begins not with the couple themselves at all, but with the men who control their respective futures. The true binding moment of any Athenian marriage is a formal agreement struck between your own father, or you yourself if your father has already passed, and the father of the bride, a contract in which he formally pledges his daughter to you and names the specific dowry that will accompany her into the marriage. The bride herself is not present for this negotiation, is not consulted at any point during it, and has no meaningful say in the outcome whatsoever. In the strict eyes of Athenian law, a marriage effectively begins as a handshake agreement struck between two men over a young woman's entire future. That dowry represents the genuine practical heart of the whole arrangement, and it matters enormously to how the marriage will actually function. A father sends his daughter into her new marriage accompanied by a meaningful sum of money or property, and the size of that dowry shapes a great deal of what follows: her standing within your household, the overall prestige attached to the match itself, and the seriousness with which the wider community regards the arrangement. As we touched on earlier, that dowry never quite becomes freely yours to spend however you might wish, and if the marriage were ever to end for any reason, it is meant to return with her to her original family, which grants a wife a thin but genuinely real thread of security in an arrangement otherwise remarkably short on formal protections for her. The age gap between bride and groom is stark by modern standards, and entirely taken for granted within this particular society. A bride is often in her mid-teens on her wedding day, sometimes even younger, while her new husband is frequently around 30 years old, already an established man ready to run a household and begin producing heirs of his own. This arrangement is simply how things are done here, justified by the widespread belief that a genuinely young wife can be more easily and thoroughly guided into the particular ways of her new household. To modern sensibilities, this remains deeply uncomfortable, and it deserves to be named honestly here as the historical reality it actually was, rather than smoothed over or excused away, an arrangement built almost entirely around the practical needs of the household, and never around the wishes of the young woman herself. The wedding ceremony itself, at least, is a genuine celebration, rich with ritual and real warmth in a way the cold preceding contract very much is not. There are formal sacrifices offered and generous feasting enjoyed, ritual baths taken beforehand, and the bride wears a veil that conceals her face throughout much of the proceedings. A great torchlit procession carries her from her father's house all the way to yours, accompanied by music, singing, and well wishes called out from the gathered crowd, delivering her formally into her new life and her new home. A particularly tender central moment arrives with the unveiling, when the bride at last reveals her face directly to her husband, a small but genuinely meaningful ceremony of its own that marks her formal passage from one household into another entirely. And then, quite simply, it is done. A young woman has been moved, rather like a treasured possession carrying a formal price attached, from the world of her father into the world of her new husband, there to begin the secluded, genuinely laborious life of managing a household she never chose, alongside a man she likely barely knew before that very day. If genuine tenderness eventually grows between the two of them over the following years, and sometimes it truly, genuinely does, it arrives as a happy accident rather than as the original goal of the arrangement. The actual goal from the very beginning is always the household itself, its long-term continuation, and the heirs it will eventually produce. And a household's fortunes, the Greeks firmly and sincerely believe, rest not only on careful, competent management, but on remaining firmly in the good graces of the gods themselves. Between all the feasting and philosophizing woven through your day, you must never forget the gods, because in Athens, they are genuinely everywhere, and they are watching closely at all times. Religion here is not treated as a weekly formal appointment to be kept. It is woven quietly into essentially every single hour of the day. Your own home contains its own small household altars and a sacred hearth, and you regularly pour out small libations of wine, offer little scraps of food, and murmur brief prayers before meals, before journeys, and before both large and small decisions alike. Keeping the household gods genuinely content is regarded here as simple common sense, rather like maintaining good personal credit in a modern economy. Neglect them, and you are, in the Athenian view, practically inviting real disaster straight through your own front door. Honor them properly and consistently, and life tends to run smoothly. So you tip a small amount of wine onto the floor tonight before you drink, a gesture so thoroughly automatic by now that you barely even notice yourself doing it. Belief here functions, in a very real sense, as simple good housekeeping. The true center of your household religion is the hearth, the fire burning at the very heart of the home, itself sacred to a particular goddess, associated with the hearth and treated throughout the culture with genuine reverence. That flame represents far more than a simple source of warmth or a place to cook meals. It stands as the living symbol of the family itself. And keeping it burning steadily represents a quiet, ongoing daily act of genuine devotion. When a new baby is formally welcomed by being carried carefully around that very fire, or when a new bride is brought for the first time into its warm light, they are being joined not merely to a family in the ordinary sense, but to the sacred flame sitting at its very core. Different corners of your home fall under the particular protection of different divine guardians, and a genuinely careful household makes sure to honor all of them appropriately. The great God of the sky, in his role as protector of the entire household, watches over your central courtyard, where a small altar stands ready for regular offerings. In another closely related aspect, that same great God looks specifically after your storerooms, the accumulated wealth of food and wine that keeps your entire family properly fed through the year. To honor him properly in this particular role is, in a very practical sense, to pray directly over your own pantry, asking that it remain consistently full and that your family never come to genuinely want for anything essential. At your own threshold and out along the public street stand those same carved stone herms we encountered earlier during your walk through the city, set deliberately at doorways as guardians against harm and as bringers of good fortune to those who properly honor them. You touch them respectfully, tend to them when needed, and treat them with real, consistent respect as you come and go from your home each day. To damage one deliberately is considered a genuinely grave and rather frightening act within this culture. Guarding the boundary between your own home and the wider, more dangerous world outside is treated here as genuinely serious spiritual business. And these small stone sentinels do exactly that quiet work on your behalf. The daily practice of all this religious observance is gentle and remarkably constant, rather than grand or dramatic in any particular way. A small splash of wine tipped from your cup before drinking, offered up as the god's rightful share of the evening. A few crumbs or the very first small portion of a meal set carefully aside. A murmured prayer spoken quietly before setting out on any journey or beginning something genuinely important. Small offerings left regularly at the household altars scattered through your home. None of it is particularly dramatic in the moment, and most of it has become so thoroughly habitual by now that you perform these small gestures almost entirely without conscious thought, rather the way a modern person might knock instinctively on wood, or make a quiet wish without ever truly deciding to do so. Underlying every single bit of this daily practice is a worldview in which the divine and the entirely ordinary are never treated as genuinely separate realms at all. The gods here are not distant beings visited only occasionally at grand temples on special designated days. They are understood to be present continuously in your fire, your storeroom, your doorway, your evening cup, woven thoroughly into the fabric of your ordinary daily life, and genuinely interested in you, whether or not you happen to consciously remember them in any given moment. To live piously within this framework is not experienced as any kind of burden. It is simply understood as living correctly, carefully tending your ongoing relationship with the powers believed to quietly govern absolutely everything around you. And if the small, humble gods of your own household deserve this kind of consistent daily care, the great gods of the entire city demand something considerably larger and far more spectacular in return. For that, ordinary daily life stops altogether, and the entire city pours enthusiastically out into the streets together. If you have ever felt that your own calendar runs impossibly full, take some genuine comfort in this, because the Athenian calendar is considerably worse. It is absolutely stuffed with religious festivals that collectively devour a genuinely staggering portion of the entire year. There are dozens of them scattered throughout the calendar, ranging from the deeply solemn and reverent to the openly riotous and celebratory. And as a wealthy citizen yourself, you are fully expected to show up, participate meaningfully, and quite often help personally fund the resulting spectacle out of your own pocket. The single greatest of these festivals is a grand procession climbing up to the Acropolis in honor of the city's own patron goddess, and a separate festival devoted to Dionysus centers entirely on theater and wine, effectively shutting down ordinary business across the entire city for its full duration. Festivals like these mean formal sacrifices, generous feasting, organized competitions, and notably, rare public appearances by the women of the city who otherwise remain largely out of public view. They are genuinely holy occasions. They are genuinely joyful occasions. And they also happen to be, rather conveniently, an excellent, socially acceptable excuse to avoid doing any real work whatsoever for the duration. The sheer number of these festivals is genuinely difficult to overstate. A remarkable share of the total days in the Athenian calendar year are given over entirely to one religious observance or another. So many, in fact, that the city seems perpetually to be either gearing up excitedly for the next festival or slowly recovering from the last one just concluded. For all this culture's public talk of hard work and firm discipline, the Athenians have built themselves a calendar containing an astonishing amount of sacred holiday time, baked directly into its very structure. And nobody within the city is genuinely expected to labor, while the gods are actively being honored through festival. The crown jewel of this entire religious calendar is the grand festival held for the city's own patron goddess. And every fourth year, this same festival swells into an especially magnificent, extended version of itself. Its true centerpiece is an enormous public procession that winds slowly through the entire city and climbs finally up the sacred rock of the Acropolis, carrying a newly woven ceremonial robe as a formal gift for the goddess, along with sacrificial animals, various offerings, and what feels very much like the entire population of the city dressed in its absolute finest clothing. It represents the city putting itself proudly on display before its own divine protector, a genuine spectacle of civic pride, and taking part personally is regarded as both a solemn duty and a considerable honor. Formal sacrifice sits near the very heart of nearly every festival celebrated in this city, and it comes attached to a genuinely practical upside for ordinary residents. Animals are ceremonially offered to the gods on the great public altars, and after the divine portion has been properly burned as an offering, the remaining meat is distributed among the gathered people and enthusiastically feasted upon. In a world where fresh meat represents a genuine, rare luxury on most ordinary days, festival days become the occasions when ordinary Athenians actually get to eat it, courtesy of the gods, and quite often, courtesy of wealthy men like yourself who have footed the considerable bill for the sacrifice. Genuine piety and a genuinely good meal arrive here hand in hand, walking together. Festivals also represent one of the very few occasions when the otherwise secluded women of the city step fully into genuine public life, and for certain specific celebrations, they take center stage entirely. Certain festivals throughout the calendar are led directly by women or reserved specifically for them alone, granting them a rare, formally sanctioned role within the great public rituals of the wider community. For women whose ordinary daily lives are spent almost entirely indoors, out of public sight, these particular sacred days represent a genuine release, a legitimate, socially acceptable reason to gather together openly, to be seen by the wider community, and to genuinely matter in the open air for once. And for a man of your particular wealth, these festivals carry one further, quite specific expectation attached, because someone within the city has to actually pay for all of this considerable splendor, and that someone is, quite often, you. The wealthiest citizens across Athens are regularly called upon to personally fund these grand public celebrations, the theatrical choruses, the elaborate processions, the full theatrical productions, effectively converting private fortune directly into shared civic glory. It is genuinely expensive to do. It represents a real financial burden on the family footing the bill. And it is simultaneously a genuinely magnificent opportunity to be publicly admired by your fellow citizens, which happens to be a tension we will return to shortly in more detail. For now, though, one particular festival deserves its own dedicated moment of attention, because from it grew one of the single greatest gifts your entire civilization would ultimately give to the wider world. It is time to go properly to the theater. One of the finest offerings within your crowded festival calendar is the theater, and attending it functions as practically a civic duty, cleverly dressed up as a thoroughly delightful day off from ordinary responsibilities. You file into a great open-air stone theater alongside many thousands of your fellow citizens at first light, and together, you watch play after play unfold steadily across an entire full day. Tragedies that leave you genuinely gutted emotionally, and comedies that mock absolutely everyone in sight, including the most powerful men seated prominently in the front rows. The actors perform wearing elaborate masks and costumes throughout. Every single role is played exclusively by men, and the greatest playwrights of the age compete fiercely against one another for coveted prizes, while the assembled crowd reacts throughout with all the raw, genuine enthusiasm of a modern sports arena. As a man of your particular wealth, you might even have personally helped fund one of today's productions, a costly civic honor that buys you both real prestige and, quite practically, a genuinely excellent seat for the performance. You settle in comfortably for the long haul ahead. It is going to be a genuinely full day of theater. The theater building itself is a genuine architectural marvel, a vast bowl of tiered stone seating carved directly into a hillside just below the Acropolis, entirely open to the sky above and capable of comfortably holding a crowd running into the many thousands. Down at the very bottom of the bowl lies the round dancing floor where the chorus performs throughout each play, and directly behind it stands the structure that serves simultaneously as scenic backdrop and practical changing space for the performers. The acoustics throughout the entire structure are genuinely extraordinary, carefully engineered so that even a single voice speaking from the floor carries clearly all the way to the highest, most distant seats, a remarkable piece of ancient design that continues to genuinely astonish visitors even in the modern era. Going to the theater here is decidedly not the quiet, intimate evening entertainment a modern person might naturally imagine when hearing the word theater. It is a genuine mass public event, formally tied to the festival of Dionysus, lasting from early morning well into evening across several consecutive days, with the entire city effectively taking a holiday together in order to attend properly. You watch an entire sequence of plays performed in a single extended sitting, tragedies performed one after another throughout the day, with comedies typically rounding things off toward the end. A full day's genuine immersion in dramatic performance that would thoroughly exhaust a modern audience, but which the Athenians themselves embrace enthusiastically as one of the genuine highlights of their entire year. The staging itself follows strict and genuinely fascinating conventions throughout. Every single performer on stage is male, playing both male and female characters alike, and every one of them wears a large, expressive mask that instantly tells the watching audience exactly who they are and what emotion they are currently feeling. A relatively small number of actors, switching quickly between masks and costumes as needed, play all the speaking roles between them, while a larger chorus sings, chants, and dances together as a kind of collective voice, commenting directly on the unfolding action and drawing the wider audience emotionally into the story. There are no elaborate special effects of any kind employed here, only carefully chosen words, live music, deliberate movement, and the powerful, stripped-down simplicity of the mask itself. It is, at its very core, structured as a genuine competition, and the Athenians would not have it structured any other way. Playwrights submit their completed works to compete directly for prizes, formally judged before the assembled eyes of the entire city, and to win is considered a tremendous personal honor, while to lose stings deeply and publicly. The greatest dramatists of this entire age battle fiercely for these coveted crowns, and the specific plays that have survived across thousands of years to move modern audiences were originally performed by men who were, quite simply, desperate to beat their immediate rivals in front of an attentive hometown crowd. Great art and fierce competitive sport are, in this particular context, genuinely one and the same activity. And once again, wealth and civic life remain thoroughly tangled together throughout this entire process, because a wealthy citizen like yourself is very often the person who personally pays for an entire production. Funding a chorus, covering its training, its costumes, and its various running expenses, represents one of the great formal public duties placed squarely upon the wealthy citizens of this city, an enormous personal expense that also happens to bring enormous public prestige if the play you funded ultimately takes home the prize. Your money here can, quite literally, buy you a genuine share in immortal art, alongside the sincere admiration of your entire city. So you take your fine seat this morning, the sun climbs steadily overhead, the very first mask appears down on the floor far below, and you give yourself over fully to an entire day of the greatest dramatic performances the world has yet produced. But even the richest, most cultured life eventually runs directly into a limit that no amount of personal fortune can buy its way past. Sooner or later, you are going to fall genuinely ill. And here the ancient world becomes genuinely, quietly nerve-wracking. Sooner or later, even the filthy rich fall ill, and here the ancient world becomes something genuinely unsettling to consider closely. Greek medicine, for its particular time and place in history, is remarkably thoughtful in its underlying approach. Physicians working within a particular medical tradition genuinely look for natural, observable causes of disease, rather than simply blaming an angry God for every affliction, which represents a genuinely real intellectual leap forward for the era. Unfortunately, the leading medical theory of the day holds that overall health depends entirely on a proper balance of 4 distinct bodily fluids, and treatment therefore often means prescribing special diets, extended rest, deliberate purging, or, quite often, simply waiting and hoping the body sorts itself out naturally. There are no antibiotics available anywhere in this world, no genuinely reliable surgical techniques, and no real understanding whatsoever of infection as a biological process. Being wealthy buys you access to the very best physician currently available and a clean, comfortable place in which to be sick, and that genuinely matters a great deal. But it cannot buy you a cure that simply has not been discovered yet by anyone. You can afford essentially everything except actual medical certainty. The great genuine leap forward in Greek medicine, and it truly was a significant leap for its time, is the underlying idea that illness has real, natural causes that can be carefully observed, gradually understood, and potentially treated, rather than being viewed simply as divine punishment handed down from an offended God. Physicians in this tradition begin watching their patients closely and systematically, carefully noting symptoms, tracking exactly how a particular sickness progresses over time, and attempting to predict its likely future course based on prior observation. This careful, patient observation, this genuine insistence on examining the actual body rather than looking only toward the heavens for answers, lays real foundations for everything medicine would eventually become many centuries later. For the ancient world of this era, it represents a genuinely revolutionary shift in thinking. The real trouble lies in the specific theory these physicians ultimately build on top of their otherwise sound instincts. The leading medical idea of the day holds that the human body contains 4 essential fluids, and that overall health is simply a matter of keeping these 4 fluids in proper balance with one another, while illness itself means that one particular fluid has run to excess or fallen into deficiency. It is an elegant theory, internally logical, and almost entirely wrong in its actual medical substance. Yet it dominates serious medical thinking for an astonishingly long stretch of history. Treatment, accordingly, aims primarily at restoring this theoretical balance, which is precisely where matters tend to grow genuinely unpleasant for the actual patient involved. To rebalance these supposed fluids, a physician might reasonably prescribe changes in diet, extended rest, and general lifestyle adjustments, approaches that are often genuinely harmless and sometimes even mildly helpful in practice. But he might just as easily turn to deliberate purging, induced sweating, and various other methods intended to force the supposed excess fluid physically out of the body. Treatments that range in practice from largely useless to actively, genuinely harmful to the patient's actual condition. For a great many medical conditions, the honest truth of the matter is that the very best a physician of this era can realistically offer is easing the patient's immediate comfort, providing sensible advice about proper rest and diet, and then simply waiting to see whether the body manages to heal itself naturally over time. Sometimes it genuinely does. Sometimes, unfortunately, it very much does not. The hard practical limits here remain genuinely stark throughout this era. There are no antibiotics available anywhere, so an infection that would prove entirely trivial to treat in a modern hospital can easily turn fatal here. Surgery remains crude, genuinely agonizing for the patient, and enormously risky in practice, with no true underlying understanding of how wounds actually become infected, and no reliable way whatsoever to prevent that infection from occurring. A broken bone, a serious wound, a fever that simply will not break on its own, any one of these common conditions could easily prove fatal, and there is genuinely little a physician can do beyond trying his best, hoping for a good outcome, and quietly preparing the surrounding family for the very real possibility of the worst. When earthly medicine ultimately fails a patient, many people in this era turn instead to the divine for help, and here the old gods return once more to the story. The seriously sick often travel considerable distances to reach sacred healing sanctuaries dedicated to the god of medicine, where they sleep overnight within the holy precinct itself, genuinely hoping that the god will visit them personally in a dream and either cure their affliction outright or reveal the proper remedy needed. It blends together genuine faith, physical rest, and the real, powerful comfort of hope into a single healing practice. And the walls of these particular sanctuaries are hung thickly with offerings left behind by those who sincerely believe they were healed there. When the physicians of the city genuinely run out of answers, the gods represent where people naturally turn next. For all of your considerable wealth, this remains the one particular arena where money genuinely reaches its own hard limit. It buys you the finest physician currently available anywhere in the city, the cleanest possible room to recover in, the most attentive care your household can provide, and generally the best available odds of recovery. And none of those things are genuinely nothing. They matter a great deal in practice. But wealth simply cannot buy a cure that has not yet been discovered by anyone. And in the end, the rich man and the poor man alike face precisely the same dangerous fevers, with precisely the same fundamental uncertainty hanging over them. Which naturally raises the question you have spent this entire luxurious day quietly avoiding. All of this wealth, all of this considerable comfort, where does it actually, honestly come from? Now for the question you have politely avoided confronting throughout this entire day. Where does all of this money genuinely come from? The honest answer is not particularly glamorous. A great deal of Athenian wealth flows directly from land ownership, from active trade across the wider Mediterranean world, and above all else, from silver, dug directly out of nearby mines by enslaved workers laboring under conditions so genuinely brutal that very few of them survived the experience for long. The comfortable life you have personally enjoyed since dawn broke this morning, the oil, the wine, the kushes, the abundant leisure time, was ultimately underwritten by real suffering you will personally never have to witness firsthand. Wealthy families like your own also invest actively in workshops, real estate holdings, and maritime shipping ventures. But the true foundation stone beneath all of it remains human labor that received essentially nothing meaningful in genuine return. It is, by any measure, a genuinely beautiful life you lead today. It simply was not built by your own hands, and it was not built kindly toward those who actually built it. Land represents the oldest and most respectable source of wealth in this society, precisely the kind an aristocrat feels genuinely proud to name publicly. Owning agricultural estates out in the countryside, worked by enslaved laborers and tenant farmers alike, brings in grain, olives, wine, and all the various produce that both feeds a household directly and fills a family fortune over time. To live comfortably off your own land is considered the genuinely honorable way to be wealthy in this culture, clean and dignified, the authentic wealth of a true gentleman rather than the grubby wealth of a mere merchant. A great deal of the old established money throughout Athens sits comfortably today on inherited agricultural fields passed down through generations. Trade, though frequently looked down upon by the more snobbish members of the aristocracy, represents where genuinely new fortunes can actually be made in this era, because Athens sits at the very heart of an extensive web of active sea routes, reaching outward across the entire known world of the time. Ships carry the city's fine pottery, its valuable olive oil, and its precious silver outward to distant markets, and bring back grain, timber, various luxuries, and useful goods from every direction imaginable. Financing these particular voyages, investing directly in cargo shipments, and lending money to the merchants who actually sail these routes represents a genuine, well-trodden path to real riches, one that many a wealthy Athenian quietly walks, even while publicly pretending that all of his family's money originates entirely from his ancestral farmland. But the true underlying engine, the actual source that makes Athens not merely comfortable but genuinely powerful on the world stage, is silver, and this is precisely where the story turns genuinely dark. The city sits near remarkably rich veins of silver ore, and the mines tapping into those veins produce the underlying wealth that builds the city's naval fleet, funds its various wars, and underwrites the entire golden age you are personally living through today. That silver does not simply lift itself willingly out of the earth on its own. It is extracted through the forced labor of enslaved people, thousands upon thousands of them, laboring in cramped, choking, entirely lightless tunnels under conditions so severe that for many of them, it effectively amounts to a slow death sentence carried out gradually underground. This particular part of your world must not be smoothed over or quietly ignored. The leisure you have personally enjoyed throughout this entire day, every single hour of genuine ease, every fine object you own, rests ultimately on a foundation of real human suffering deliberately kept well out of your direct sight, performed by people whose individual names were never recorded by history, and whose eventual deaths went entirely unmourned by the wider society that benefited from their labor. The gleaming, cultured, philosophical Athens that the wider world would come to remember and admire for centuries afterward was powered in very large part by a system of brutal forced labor that its many beneficiaries, including you, generally preferred not to think about too closely. Both of these things remain true simultaneously, and genuine honesty requires holding them together in the mind at the same time, rather than choosing one comfortable narrative over the other. Wealthy families throughout Athens spread their accumulated fortunes across all of these various channels at once: land, trade, silver mining, and money lending, alongside workshops staffed by enslaved craftsmen turning out pottery, weapons, furniture, and various goods for sale in the wider market. Diversification of this kind is genuinely not a modern financial invention. A shrewd, wealthy Athenian keeps his family fortune flowing steadily through many different channels simultaneously, And most of those channels, at some point along the way, run directly through the labor of people who were legally owned rather than freely paid for their work. So there is your honest answer, and it is genuinely not a comfortable one to sit with. You did not personally build any of this. You inherited it, invested it further, and thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was originally raised on the backs of the unfree and the deliberately unseen. And possessing a great personal fortune in Athens comes with one further surprise that even you might not fully expect, because this particular city holds very particular ideas about precisely what a wealthy man genuinely owes back to it in return. Being wealthy in Athens comes attached with a genuine bill, and it arrives in the specific form of a public duty system that is either noble civic generosity or, depending entirely on how you happen to feel about it in any given year, a very elaborately disguised tax. Rather than a modern, broad income tax applied evenly across the population, the city instead expects its wealthiest individual citizens to personally fund essential public expenses directly. Things like staging a full festival play, or the single largest obligation of all, equipping and fully maintaining a warship for an entire year of active naval service. This particular obligation proves staggeringly expensive in practice, and men throughout the city genuinely compete with one another to fulfill it lavishly, because paying up generously buys enormous public prestige, while attempting to dodge the obligation entirely buys correspondingly lasting public shame. On top of all this, if war should come to the city, you are further expected to personally armor yourself and fight directly in the front lines as heavy infantry. Wealth here does not exempt you from civic duty in any way. It practically enlists you directly into active service. The underlying logic of this entire system feels genuinely strange to modern sensibilities, but proves oddly effective in actual practice. Rather than collecting one broad, regular tax from the general population, and then deciding centrally how to spend the proceeds, the city instead simply points directly at its wealthiest individual citizens and assigns each of them specific, named public expenses to personally cover entirely out of their own pockets. You are not asked merely to contribute your fair share to some general public fund. You are told plainly that this particular year, you personally will be paying in full for that particular public expense, and you are fully expected to handle it well and generously. The lighter version of this obligation funds the city's great religious festivals, and even this lighter version proves expensive enough in practice. Sponsoring a theatrical chorus for the public festival means personally paying to recruit, train, costume, and fully support the performers throughout an entire dramatic production, bearing the complete cost of bringing a play properly before the assembled city. It could genuinely ruin a careless or overly ambitious man financially if handled poorly. But it could also make his public name and reputation. Because if the specific production he personally funded goes on to win its competition, the resulting glory reflects directly and immediately back onto him as its patron. Your money, in this system, quite literally buys genuine art, and that art in turn buys you lasting fame throughout the city. The heavier version of this same obligation funds the city's navy directly, and it operates in an entirely different league altogether. The single most demanding civic duty of all is to personally take full responsibility for an entire warship, one of the swift, formidable vessels that made Athens the genuine master of the surrounding sea, and to keep that vessel properly equipped, well-maintained, and fully seaworthy across an entire year of active naval service. This obligation means personally covering all necessary repairs, essential gear, and countless smaller running expenses, and quite often taking a direct, hands-on role in actually commanding the vessel yourself during its service. It represents a genuinely colossal financial burden, the sort that could meaningfully dent even a truly great family fortune, and it falls specifically on the shoulders of the wealthiest men across the entire city. And yet, here is the genuinely fascinating part of the whole arrangement. Men throughout Athens actively compete with one another to fulfill these particular obligations, and to fulfill them more splendidly and generously than their immediate rivals manage to do. Discharging a great public duty lavishly represents one of the single surest ways available to win the genuine admiration and lasting gratitude of your fellow citizens. To build a personal reputation for real generosity and patriotism that pays off handsomely later in the form of influence, goodwill, and useful protection whenever you might genuinely need it. To be perceived as stingy or to attempt dodging your assigned obligation entirely is to invite widespread public contempt instead. So the wealthy across this city spend generously, effectively transforming a system of taxation into a strange, ongoing sort of public status competition among themselves. The city has even built in a rather clever internal check against attempted cheating within this system. If you happen to be assigned a particularly expensive public duty and genuinely believe some other specific man in the city is actually wealthier than you and better positioned to afford it, you are formally permitted to challenge him directly, demanding either that he personally take on the burden in your place, or that the two of you simply swap your entire estates outright with one another. This genuinely ingenious, slightly mad arrangement makes it extremely risky for any man to pretend publicly that he is poorer than he actually is, since falsely crying poverty could easily cost him his entire family fortune in the resulting estate exchange. Beyond all of this lies the oldest civic obligation of all placed upon wealthy citizens, to personally fight for the city whenever called upon. Men who can genuinely afford proper armor and weapons form the heavy infantry line, standing shoulder to shoulder with their fellow citizens in the actual battle line whenever the city goes to war, which happens with genuine, uncomfortable frequency throughout this era. Your considerable wealth does not keep you safely tucked away at home during wartime. It puts you directly into armor and places you squarely in the expected front rank of battle. In Athens, the true price of a great personal fortune is a great deal of giving that fortune directly back to the city, in money during peacetime, and when required, in actual blood during war. And there remains one final, universal duty that eventually comes for every single man in this city, rich or poor alike, one that no fortune anywhere can ever manage to escape, and no civic liturgy can ever cover on your behalf. And so we arrive, gently, at the very end, both of your extraordinarily long day and, eventually, of your entire fortunate life, because even the filthy rich must someday meet precisely the same fate as everyone else around them. When a wealthy Athenian eventually dies, the send-off given to him is genuinely elaborate. The body is carefully washed, anointed thoroughly with fine oil, properly dressed, and laid out at home for a period of formal mourning, during which the women of the family lead loud, ritualized lamentations throughout the household. Then follows a formal procession to the chosen burial site, along with offerings meant to sustain the departing soul on its long journey toward the underworld, ferried, according to the old stories passed down through generations, across a dark river by a boatman who fully expects to be properly paid for his service. Grand tombs and carefully carved monuments mark the final resting places of the genuinely wealthy, ensuring that even in death itself, the rich remain thoroughly impossible for anyone to simply overlook or ignore. You lived your entire life in genuine comfort, and you will ultimately be buried in comparable style, which in Athens represents rather the entire underlying point of the whole exercise. The rituals surrounding death unfold across careful, deliberate stages, and the women of the household lead the very first of them. The body is washed with genuine care, anointed thoroughly with fine oil, wrapped properly, and laid out upon a bier within the home itself, so that family members and close friends can come together to mourn properly around it. The women of the family raise their voices together in formal, ritualized lamentation, weeping openly, wailing, singing traditional dirges, and tearing at their own hair in a display of grief that is fully expected, carefully ritualized, and treated as genuinely serious throughout the community. Mourning here is understood as real work, and it is work that falls specifically to the women of the household to perform. Before dawn breaks the following day, a solemn procession carries the deceased from the family home to the chosen place of burial, a quiet parade moving through the still dark streets, with the body borne carefully along and the assembled mourners following respectfully behind. The body might then either be buried whole or cremated upon a funeral pyre, with both practices commonly used depending on family custom, and any resulting ashes carefully gathered into a decorated urn. Either way, the dead are ultimately laid to rest beyond the edge of the living city, within burial grounds that line the main roads leading outward from town. The Greeks genuinely believe that the departed soul does not simply vanish into nothing at death, but instead journeys onward toward the underworld, and the dead are properly equipped for that difficult passage. Small offerings are placed carefully with the body, including the famous small coin, meant to pay the grim ferryman who carries departed souls across the dark river, dividing the world of the living from the land of the dead. To be buried without these proper rites performed correctly is considered a genuine horror, leaving the departed soul to wander eternally, unable to complete its necessary journey, which is precisely why giving the dead their full due is regarded as among the most sacred of all human obligations. For the genuinely wealthy, death also inevitably represents one final, last opportunity for public display. The rich raise grand tombs and carefully carved stone monuments over their departed loved ones, sculpted markers often depicting the deceased in dignified, composed scenes, frequently surrounded by grieving family members, gazing calmly outward across the passing centuries that follow. These beautiful memorials, lining the roads leading out of the city, function simultaneously as genuine, heartfelt tributes to the dead, and as quiet, unmistakable advertisements of the surviving family's wealth and continued social standing. Even within the grave itself, the aristocracy of this city finds a way to remain visibly, unmistakably seen by all who pass. In fact, these displays of public grief and elaborate monument building eventually grew so competitive and so extravagant among wealthy families that the city itself was ultimately forced to step in and formally rein them in, placing official limits on precisely how elaborate a funeral could be and how dramatically the women present were permitted to mourn in public. When even a family's private grief and its carved tombstones become just another form of public status competition, a society may eventually decide, quite reasonably, that enough is genuinely enough. The persistent impulse to turn absolutely everything, even death itself, into a contest of relative status proved apparently very difficult indeed for the wealthy of this city to resist entirely. And so your day, and eventually your entire life, comes gently to its natural close. You lived in a fine house built carefully around a sunlit central courtyard, waited on faithfully from dawn until dusk, draped comfortably in perfumed cloth, fed on rare fish and famous, carefully sourced wine, schooled thoroughly in poetry and persuasive rhetoric, honored regularly at grand civic festivals, and buried at last beneath a proud stone monument standing along the very road leading out of the city you once helped to govern. It was, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely extraordinary life. And yet, as the lamps burn steadily lower and the long night finally settles fully over ancient Athens, it is genuinely worth pausing to consider what that glittering life actually rested upon throughout, and to remember all the people who quietly made it possible, and who were never once permitted to share meaningfully in it themselves. So there it is, a single day lived among the filthy rich of ancient Greece. You woke this morning on a leather-strung bed, scraped yourself thoroughly clean with a curved bronze blade, draped yourself carefully in perfumed cloth, and drifted steadily through the marketplace, the gymnasium, and the reclining drinking couch, wanting for almost nothing at all throughout the entire day. By the honest measure of the ancient world, it was a life of truly extraordinary comfort, the kind that most people who have ever actually lived could only dream of experiencing even briefly. And still, as we followed it carefully hour by hour together, the very same quiet truth kept steadily rising back to the surface. Your wine was watered down. Your teeth were slowly rotting. Your available medicine was made mostly of sincere hope rather than genuine cure. And beneath all the marble and all the leisure lay an entire hidden world of people who made that comfort genuinely possible, and who were never once allowed to share in it themselves. So tonight, spare a gentle thought, not merely for the wealthy few who reclined comfortably on their couches, but for the many who quietly held that entire beautiful arrangement up from underneath, the women who ran entire households in silence, the tutors, cooks, and nurses who shaped lives that were never truly their own to live, and the countless unnamed people laboring endlessly in the darkness of the mines who genuinely built a golden age they themselves would never once taste or enjoy. Their quiet endurance, entirely unrecorded and largely unthanked by history, remained stitched invisibly into everything that world eventually became and everything it left behind for us to remember. And when you settle now into your own soft, comfortable bed tonight, with warm water waiting quietly behind a simple tap, with genuine medicine that actually heals rather than merely hopes, and a home that belongs entirely, wonderfully to you alone, let yourself genuinely feel just how remarkable that quiet reality truly is. No one drew your bath tonight by hand. No one suffered in darkness so that your own light might comfortably glow. These small, easily forgotten comforts would have been the genuine envy of emperors and aristocrats alike throughout the ancient world. So rest now. Let the marble city slowly fade from view. Let the lamps burn low and gently gutter out and drift off, knowing that you have lived through one whole ancient day and found your way safely, gently home. Sleep.